Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Tonight, we settle into the gentle origins of a figure who feels almost as real as any statesman or inventor, though he stepped onto the world's stage from the quiet pages of fiction. Sherlock Holmes, with his calm reasoning and steady gaze, belongs to an age when London's fog still clung to lampposts and curiosity could carry a person farther than money or rank. In approaching his story, we look not for thrills, but for understanding how a particular kind of mind grows, how habits form, and how one thoughtful observer could become a symbol of clarity in a bustling world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you would like, feel free to share your location and the local time as you listen. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sherlock Holmes began, as most remarkable figures do, not with spectacle, but with quiet inclinations that seemed ordinary at first glance. He belonged to a family that prized education without making a ceremony out of it. His relatives were noted for their particular talents. One, an expert in art, another known for mathematical work, yet none carried an air of bravado. They were the sort of people who could spend an afternoon absorbed in a single problem without noticing the time. In such surroundings, Sherlock developed a habit of watching before speaking. He often sat with a book open, though he was sometimes more absorbed in observing the small routines of the household than in reading the page in front of him. This calm, attentive childhood set the foundation for the man he would become. He learned early that the world rarely announced its important details. They tended to appear in the corner of one's vision, waiting to be recognized. He took quiet pleasure in sorting things. Stones from the garden path, feathers from the countryside walks, arranged not for collecting, but for understanding. While other children played energetic games, he preferred investigating how things worked. He once took apart a family clock simply to examine the gears, then reassembled it with such careful precision that no one noticed it had ever been disturbed. The era into which he was born encouraged such curiosity. Britain was shifting steadily through the 19th century, a time when scientific methods were becoming part of daily life. People were learning to trust measured observation, and newspapers regularly printed accounts of new machines, archaeological discoveries, or social studies. Holmes absorbed these influences naturally. He never declared himself an intellectual prodigy. He merely followed the quiet tug of interest from one subject to another. Chemistry fascinated him for a time, then botany, then certain branches of history. He was the kind of boy who remembered small facts without trying, often surprising adults by recalling an overlooked detail about a visiting relative or a change in the arrangement of the sitting room shelves. Life in the Holmes household was steady, with rhythms that suited a child who preferred contemplation. Mealtimes passed calmly, and Sherlock sometimes entertained himself by noticing how often a fork was lifted or how a pattern repeated on the tablecloth. These observations weren't tricks. They were simply part of how he interacted with the world. If someone mislaid a glove or piece of mail, he was often the one who quietly retrieved it by remembering where it had last been placed. He grew used to the gentle amusement this caused among family members. They thought of it as a charming trait rather than an unusual gift. He also liked long walks, especially in cooler weather. The countryside gave him a chance to watch nature in slow motion, the way tracks formed in the earth, how a breeze shifted branches, or how animals behaved when they felt unobserved. These early wanderings planted the seeds of the deductive methods he would later refine. There was a calmness in his footsteps, as if the landscape offered lessons to anyone who cared to look closely enough. He occasionally grew so absorbed in a question that he forgot small routines. More than once, he left a window open overnight, because he had paused to consider something and moved on without finishing the simple act of closing it. His family grew accustomed to finding him standing still in a hallway, deep in thought, as if time had paused for him. These moments were neither dramatic nor grand. They were simply signs of a mind always sifting through information. He also had a tendency to experiment with small things when he was bored, mixing harmless household ingredients to see how they reacted, or studying the markings on postage stamps under the light of an oil lamp. None of this suggested a future detective in the heroic sense. Instead, it pointed toward a young man developing comfort with method and patient study. Sherlock's schooling expanded this natural bent. He wasn't the sort of student teachers boasted about, but he did well in subjects that rewarded careful attention. Latin and mathematics appealed to him for their structure, though he admitted occasionally that their strict systems lacked the surprises he enjoyed. What truly engaged him were classes that allowed room for interpretation history, where he could follow the threads of cause and effect and certain aspects of natural science. He observed his classmates too, noticing how each one approached a task differently. These small social insights created the early basis for his later understanding of human behaviour, though he never claimed to be intuitive in the emotional sense. Instead, he understood people by watching how they moved, spoke, or handled objects. At home, his older brother Mycroft provided a curious example. Mycroft possessed a remarkable mind, perhaps even greater than Sherlock's, but lived in a far more sedentary manner. He preferred comfort, routine, and predictable environments. Sherlock admired him, but sensed that he himself required movement, puzzles, and change. Their differences quietly shaped his own approach to life. From Mycroft, he learned the value of systems and logic. From himself, he learned that understanding also needed curiosity and a willingness to step beyond the familiar. As the 19th century progressed, Britain's social structure was evolving. Expanding cities, improved transportation, and growing interest in scientific inquiry all contributed to an environment in which someone with Sherlock's sensibilities could thrive. However, nothing in these early years hinted at fame. His habits were private, his interests personal. He did not imagine the world would one day recognize his methods. He only knew that he felt most at ease when sorting through information, piecing together small truths that others walked past without noticing. Sherlock's teens saw the emergence of another quiet trait, a preference for solitude when thinking. While he enjoyed company and moderation, he often stepped away from gatherings to find a corner where he could reflect. This habit continued throughout his life, not out of aloofness but because his thoughts required space. He once remarked, in later years, that people seldom realized how much silence contributed to understanding. In his youth, this meant sitting near a window with a notebook, sketching diagrams that made sense only to him, or recording observations about daily occurrences. He did not imagine himself heroic or particularly unusual. He was simply following the internal rhythm of a mind that sought patterns. The adults around him, amused by his quiet seriousness, sometimes described him as old for his age, but Sherlock himself saw nothing unusual in preferring a well-sorted set of facts to a noisy afternoon. As he approached adulthood, the foundations of his character were already in place: clarity over emotion, precision over haste, curiosity over custom. These belong not to a legend, but to a young man learning to navigate the world one detail at a time. His early years did not predict dramatic adventures ahead. Rather, they formed a gentle bedrock upon which the rest of his life would build. The detective the world would come to admire began as a boy who liked to understand things just a little more deeply than required, a mind taking form. Sherlock Holmes grew into early adulthood with a sense of quiet steadiness, the sort that made his days feel structured, even when he had no grand plan guiding him. The years that followed his childhood brought the natural expansions of independence. Time spent away from home, new studies, new acquaintances, and a widening curiosity that stretched across subjects with deliberate calm. Nothing about this stage of his life suggested the dramatic figure later imagined in illustrations, hunched over clues in dark rooms or chasing criminals through fog. The reality was gentler. He was simply learning what kind of thinker he wished to become, and as often happens, he discovered that by engaging with the world one small puzzle at a time. He did not rush into university with bold ambition. Rather, he entered with the practical understanding that he needed structure in order to sharpen his growing fascination with observation. The university campus, with its mix of lectures, laboratories, libraries and open courtyards, suited him well. It offered enough activity to feed his curiosity and enough routines to support his love of quiet study. He developed certain habits, arriving early to classrooms not to sit in the front, but to choose a seat with good lighting. Collecting small notebooks because he disliked running out of space mid-thought. And carrying chalk in his pocket to sketch diagrams on available surfaces, even if the nearest available surface happened to be a spare wooden crate. There was nothing dramatic about these tendencies, though a custodian once complained mildly about mysterious chalk markings appearing on the back of a bench. Sherlock, hearing the complaint, began wiping down the bench after each use. A small compromise, and one he carried out with polite diligence. He also formed a habit of lingering after lectures, not to converse but to think. Many students rushed to pubs or gatherings, while Sherlock preferred pacing the pathways between buildings as he sorted through ideas. He often noticed that solitary pacing helped him observe the overlooked footprints in soft earth, the shifting expression of a passer-by, or a dropped item on the grass. It brought the world into focus, sharpening his mind through the simplest of details. And occasionally, these observations pulled him into small investigations, almost without his realizing it. His earliest unofficial case, if one could call it that, occurred during his second term. A professor of natural philosophy misplaced a stack of exam papers, sending the entire department into quiet agitation. Sherlock, watching the professor search his office with increasing frustration, happened to notice a faint impression on the man's sleeve, a smudge of graphite that did not match anything in the cramped workspace. Few people would give such a mark a second glance, but Holmes paused. Graphite was common, yet this particular smudge appeared in a manner suggesting the sleeve had brushed against the sharp edge of a writing box rather than a loose drawing stick. The professor's office contained no such box, but the lecture hall did. Sherlock followed the idea with the calm deliberation of someone tidying a drawer. He walked to the hall, examined the lectern, and noticed a set of older examination envelopes wedged behind a loose panel. To retrieve them, he had to reach in at an angle that left a smear similar to the one the professor carried on his sleeve. When he returned the papers, the professor thanked him warmly and asked how he found them. Sherlock offered a simple explanation, omitting the graphite observation because it felt unnecessary to mention. It was a quiet success, uncelebrated and nearly forgotten, yet it signalled that his developing habits had begun shaping him into something more precise than a curious student. Another small case arose when a fellow student accused a roommate of borrowing books without permission. Sherlock agreed to help not out of enthusiasm for conflict, but because he disliked disordered assumptions. He inspected the bookshelf and noticed the dust line where the missing volume once rested. The shape of the dust suggested not a hurried removal, but the gentle, careful lifting of someone who respected books. The roommate, on the other hand, handled his belongings with admirable chaos, leaving stacks of papers leaning like precarious towers. The gentle removal pointed elsewhere. Holmes soon identified the true borrower, a friend of the household who had visited earlier that week, and left a faint trail of chalk he habitually carried in his coat pocket. This amused Sherlock slightly. He secretly wondered whether everyone who enjoyed solving puzzles eventually became someone who left chalk trails behind. He returned the book discreetly and left the students to resolve the matter without further dispute. These minor episodes shaped his thinking more than formal study. University lectures offered theories, but daily life offered examples. Sherlock began testing ideas in casual ways, dropping objects at measured intervals to observe reactions, studying ink absorption on various papers, watching how often people repeated familiar gestures when nervous, or examining discarded cigarette stubs for subtle differences. Once, when craving a brief distraction from a long chemistry assignment, he attempted to determine whether he could identify which of 3 students used a fountain pen with an unusually worn nib based solely on handwriting pressure. He succeeded, though he admitted afterward that the accomplishment probably impressed him more than anyone else. Yet it amused him enough to record it in a notebook with the understated satisfaction of someone discovering an unexpectedly successful recipe. During this time, Holmes also encountered the breadth of intellectual movements sweeping through the late 19th century. Britain was shifting into a modern age, and scientific thinking was gaining prominence. Scholars debated classification systems, technological innovations, and new forensic possibilities. Newspapers reported advancements in microscopy, chemistry, and the study of human behaviour. These discussions reinforced Sherlock's conviction that the world could be understood if one learned how to examine it correctly. He never claimed superiority, he simply believed accuracy was preferable to guesswork. This belief became a guiding principle in all his later investigations. It was also during these years that Holmes first experimented with chemical analysis. He spent long afternoons in university laboratories running harmless tests, studying reactions, testing dyes, and examining soil samples. Some students found the work tedious, but Holmes found it soothing. The controlled environment allowed him to test specific variables and observe predictable results. He once noted the different scents of various chemical compounds with such precision that a laboratory assistant, upon overhearing him, jokingly referred to him as the nose of the department. Holmes neither denied nor embraced the comment. He simply made a note to develop a better method for identifying compounds by sight rather than smell. He often forgot to eat when immersed in problem solving. It wasn't intentional. He simply underestimated how long he had been sitting when analysing a question. Friends occasionally found him leaning over a table full of notes, surprised to learn an entire afternoon had passed. One friend, worried about his absent-mindedness, once left a biscuit on Sherlock's notebook as a reminder. Holmes later ate it without noticing it had been a reminder at all. This small habit for getting meals while absorbed in work remained with him throughout life, though he eventually learned to keep fruit on hand to prevent others from worrying. More notably, his university years contained the first instance of a case resembling the detective work that would define him. A local stable owner lost several valuable horses, not through theft but by mysterious illness affecting only certain animals. The owner sought help from various experts, none of whom could agree on the cause. Word of the puzzle reached a group of students who debated it enthusiastically. Sherlock listened quietly, not because he was uninterested, but because he preferred forming conclusions without the influence of lively speculation. He visited the stable with permission from the owner, who welcomed anyone offering reasonable insight. Holmes observed the horses with a steady, unhurried eye. He noticed patterns. Only those animals kept nearest the old wooden fence were affected. He examined the fence with the same calm attention he applied to books or experiments. The wood showed signs of decay, and a particular fungus difficult to spot unless one knew where to look had begun spreading across its base. Holmes recognized the fungus from a lecture series on plant toxins. The horses nearest the fence had likely grazed on the affected grass, ingesting small quantities of harmful spores. His explanation proved correct, and repairing the fence resolved the issue. The owner thanked him, unusually impressed, though Holmes accepted the gratitude with mild discomfort. He never sought attention. He merely enjoyed understanding a problem well enough to resolve it. That incident marked a shift. Sherlock realized he possessed not merely curiosity, but a growing talent for connecting disparate details. It wasn't brilliance in the dramatic sense, it was more like assembling a tidy row of dominoes in the right order. Once arranged, they simply fell where expected. He found satisfaction not in being right, but in the gentle assurance that careful study could reveal truth without unnecessary excitement. Still, Holmes recognized that mastering observation required patience. He trained himself subtly, though never in a structured program. He spent downtime memorizing different types of tobacco ash, noticing how each crumbled or held shape. He observed how ink dried at varying speeds depending on humidity, or how cloth frayed under different forms of wear. He even practiced distinguishing footsteps on wooden floors, a skill he found amusing, though not immediately useful. One late afternoon, while reviewing a set of study notes, he noticed a faint stain on the edge of the paper, pale, circular, and slightly irregular. Rather than seeing it as a nuisance, he treated it as a small puzzle. He determined through scent alone that it was from weak tea, likely spilled unintentionally by someone leaning over the table without noticing. He traced the direction of the slight colour gradient to identify where the drop had landed first. It was, in truth, a trivial observation, but he found it quietly satisfying. He later admitted in a notebook margin that the world offered endless opportunities to practice if one didn't mind appearing overly interested in ordinary things. One cannot discuss Sherlock Holmes's intellectual development without acknowledging his relationship with Mycroft, his older brother. Though academically brilliant, Mycroft approached life with remarkable stillness. Sherlock once observed that Mycroft could solve a problem faster by sitting perfectly still than most people could by pacing anxiously. The brothers met occasionally during Sherlock's university years, usually in quiet clubs where Mycroft enjoyed predictable meals. Their discussions shaped Sherlock's thinking in subtle ways. Mycroft emphasized efficiency of thought, removing unnecessary speculation and focusing on core variables. Sherlock appreciated this discipline, though he preferred more active engagement with the world. Where Mycroft found contentment in mental puzzles alone, Sherlock preferred puzzles tied to human behaviour, physical evidence, and lived experience. Mycroft sometimes teased his younger brother gently, pointing out that Sherlock's enthusiasm occasionally led him into unnecessarily complex investigations of very simple matters. Sherlock, in turn, privately noted that Mycroft's lack of physical activity limited his ability to appreciate the clues found outdoors. These mild differences shaped their respective approaches. Sherlock learned clarity from Mycroft, but kept his commitment to direct observation. This balance would become essential in his later work. During these years, Sherlock also refined the habit of keeping detailed records. He filled notebooks with observations, how candle wax dripped on different metals, how handwriting shifted with fatigue, how fabric retained faint scents even after washing. These notes were not arranged with artistic flair. They were straightforward, concise, and practical. Occasionally, he scribbled a small comment to himself, such as a reminder not to leave experiments unattended when going to open a window for fresh air that inevitably distracts. These tiny remarks reveal the human side of his developing method. Even the most disciplined mind has quirks that sneak into daily routines. As his studies progressed, Sherlock began assisting professors informally. He helped organize materials, demonstrated experiments, and occasionally offered small insights during discussions. Though he valued the intellectual environment, he knew instinctively that academic life alone would not satisfy him. He needed real-world problems, situations with variables not predetermined by textbooks, and slowly these opportunities appeared. One notable case emerged from the campus community itself. A prized antique pocket watch went missing during a student gathering. Rumours circulated quickly, and suspicion shifted among the attendees. One student, embarrassed by the growing tension, asked Sherlock for help, knowing Holmes had a reputation for noticing small things others missed. Sherlock agreed, partly because he disliked disorder, and partly because he found the matter intriguing. He examined the setting calmly. The room contained subtle clues, faint lint fibres on a windowsill, a scuff mark on the floor near the bookshelf, and a short trail of dust disturbed in an unusual pattern. Holmes followed these observations carefully, piecing together the movement of individuals through the space. His attention landed on the bookshelf, where the scuff mark suggested someone had shifted to stand against it. A small depression in the dust near the lower shelf indicated weight, likely from someone leaning or crouching. He found the watch tucked behind a stack of old journals. The placement suggested panic rather than theft. Sherlock concluded the object had been accidentally knocked from its owner's pocket during a lively gesture, then hidden unintentionally when someone stepped back. The relief among the students was immediate, and though some insisted he explain how he solved the mystery, he preferred letting them believe it had been a simple matter of good luck. It was easier than explaining how dust, scuffs, and misplaced fibres formed quiet sentences for those willing to read them. Holmes's self-training grew more deliberate. He tested his memory regularly by recording lists of items, then replacing them according to their condition, scent, or shape. He learned the characteristics of different soils, recognizing how clay stuck to boots differently from loam. He even practiced noting the rhythm of people's footsteps in hallways, a skill he approached with mild amusement. Occasionally, when identifying a familiar step, he would nod to himself as though greeting an old acquaintance, though the person approaching had no idea why Sherlock seemed pleased to see them. Another early investigation involved a series of misplaced letters affecting several students. Important notices arrived late or not at all, leading to confusion during examination season. Sherlock examined the mailboxes and noticed faint abrasions on certain compartments marks that suggested someone with larger hands had difficulty retrieving or inserting letters. Instead of suspecting foul play, he looked for a simpler explanation. The porter, responsible for delivering mail, an older man with stiff joints, often struggled with small motions. Holmes observed that the porter used a particular tool to help slide mail into narrow slots. This tool, worn from years of use, occasionally bent envelopes or pushed them slightly out of place. Holmes shared his findings discreetly, suggesting a redesigned slot mechanism. The improvement resolved the issue. The students were grateful, the porter was relieved, and Sherlock quietly enjoyed solving a problem rooted in human limitations rather than malice. It reinforced his belief that not all mysteries required dramatic conclusions. Sometimes, everyday inconveniences produce the same confusion as intentional wrongdoing. Understanding this would later prevent him from leaping to conclusions in more significant cases. These university years represent the period when Sherlock Holmes's mind truly took shape. He learned to merge observation with disciplined reasoning, to trust quiet patterns, and to understand that human behaviour, whether predictable or peculiar, could often explain what appeared mysterious. He uncovered no grand conspiracies during this stage, nor did he pursue criminals across rooftops or engage in theatrical confrontations. Instead, he solved puzzles grounded in real life: lost items, misidentified evidence, subtle misunderstandings, and quiet oversights. And through these experiences he built the framework that would guide all his future investigations. One might expect a young man destined for intellectual acclaim to carry a sense of superiority during his formative years, but Sherlock did not. He once spent an entire afternoon studying the way ink dried on envelopes, only to realise he had forgotten to mail an important letter of his own. When he finally delivered it, he noticed the postal clerk looking amused at the oddly delayed posting date. Holmes accepted this with calm resignation. Even the most attentive investigator, he realised, was not immune to the occasional oversight. By the end of his university time, Sherlock Holmes had become a man defined not by brilliance in isolation, but by persistent curiosity, attentive habits, and a gentle sense of humour that surfaced whenever he recognised how easily humans, including himself, could overlook the obvious. He had no certainty yet about his future profession, but he did know this: the world was full of puzzles waiting for those who cared to notice them, and he was becoming someone who could not help noticing. And so, quietly, steadily, his mind continued taking form, studies and strange talents. Sherlock Holmes's growth during his later university years moved in subtle lines rather than bold leaps. The days had a quiet rhythm: lectures that offered structured information, long evenings in libraries where dust settled on half-forgotten volumes, and hours spent in laboratories where small experiments hummed along under controlled lamplight. What distinguished Sherlock from his peers was not impatience or brilliance announced dramatically, but his habit of letting each environment teach him something different. He seemed to treat the campus as a living map of interconnected ideas, each hallway a path to some overlooked detail that could sharpen his skills. He devoted increasing time to chemistry, partly because it rewarded methodical thinking, and partly because he liked the predictability of reactions. Yet even in this setting, he found his own peculiar ways of learning. When other students labelled jars with neat handwriting, Sherlock sometimes included small symbols only he understood. Once, a laboratory assistant mistook one of Sherlock's cryptic marks for a warning symbol and carried it with exaggerated caution for the rest of the afternoon. Sherlock only realized later, quietly amused, and decided perhaps future labels should be more straightforward. This decision lasted a week. Then, absent-mindedly, he returned to his old habits, leaving half the department convinced he knew a coding system none of them had encountered. He explored anatomy with equal curiosity. Though he had no interest in becoming a doctor, the subject offered insight into how the human body moved, strained, faltered, and revealed stress. Holmes found it fascinating that small shifts in posture could betray someone's recent activities. The tiniest abrasions or subtle swelling in fingers told stories about tools handled or tasks completed. He took notes with the calm precision of someone cataloguing rare specimens. In those notes, occasionally, he added a small remark such as, "Remember not to hold the model skeleton by its arm joint loose," nearly fell again. His relationship to the skeleton was nearly comical. He once tried to reposition it and accidentally left it facing the corner. The next class found it standing like a sulking figure. Sherlock didn't correct the misunderstanding. The professor assumed a student had played a harmless joke, and Sherlock quietly decided that the skeleton looked rather contemplative that way. Yet his true interests lay in the interplay between science and human behaviour. He found psychology not the emotional kind, but the study of habits particularly absorbing. This fascination emerged during an unplanned observation one afternoon, when he noticed a fellow student tapping his foot while reading a paper. The tapping followed a rhythm that altered whenever the student encountered a difficult paragraph. Soon, Sherlock began timing these taps discreetly. He discovered that within 10 minutes he could predict where the student struggled based solely on the foot's rhythm. The realization made him smile vaguely, pleased not because he admired the feat, but because it confirmed something he suspected. People expressed information unconsciously, and those signals could be traced with careful attention. This belief grew stronger when he began observing how people handled objects. Some lifted items delicately, even when unnecessary. Others gripped them firmly without noticing. From the pressure of a thumbprint on a book spine or the wear on the edge of a pocket notebook, Holmes determined aspects of a person's routine. A frayed corner meant hurried habits. A clean, compressed spine indicated someone who valued tidiness and predictability. These distinctions became a quiet language he learned to read, a sort of whispering text running beneath daily human interaction. Sherlock's academic work was respectable, though never arranged to impress examiners. He often completed assignments with solid precision, yet spent 10 times as long investigating some minor curiosity entirely unrelated to his coursework. A chemistry professor once remarked that Sherlock could publish interesting research if he focused his energies. Holmes, politely appreciative but unconvinced, knew that rigid academic pathways would not lead where he needed to go. He didn't desire accolades. He wanted freedom to explore practical problems. This became clear when he encountered a situation that tested his ability to apply multiple fields of study at once. A local bookseller reported that several volumes had been damaged under mysterious circumstances. The pages showed irregular patterns of discoloration, and a few covers bore faint burns, though no fire had been present. Holmes visited the shop, drawn by curiosity. The bookseller welcomed him with gratitude tinged by confusion. Customers had begun questioning the condition of recently purchased items, and the shop risked reputational harm. Sherlock examined the volumes with serene concentration. He noticed the burn marks followed a subtle angular direction, suggesting contact with irregular heat rather than open flame. He lifted one book and caught a faint chemical scent, though barely detectable. That observation brought him back to his laboratory experience. He recognized the marks as consistent with corrosive gas exposure, perhaps from a leaking container. Tracing the scent, Holmes located a cracked bottle of cleaning solution beneath a shelf. The gas had seeped upward through small openings, affecting only books on specific tiers. His explanation relieved the bookseller, who admitted he had purchased the cleaning agent because someone recommended it as a modern improvement. Sherlock offered a slight smile, noting that not all innovations arrived fully tested. With fresh ventilation and proper storage, the issue resolved, and the bookseller continued business with renewed confidence. Holmes walked back to campus reflecting not on the success, but on the interplay of evidence, chemistry, observation, and a practical understanding of how materials behaved. Around this time, Sherlock's fascination with forensic methods deepened. He studied crime statistics, read accounts of investigations both well-handled and poorly managed, and became increasingly aware of how often assumptions intruded upon the search for truth. Many cases solved by police relied more on confessions or circumstance than rigorous evidence. Holmes began imagining how methodical reasoning might improve such inquiries, not through grand heroics but through systematic clarity. He began conducting small experiments related to investigation. In one, he tested how footprints varied depending on shoe type and soil condition. He spent a morning walking across a damp field, altering stride length and pressure. A farmer passed by and politely asked whether Sherlock was looking for worms. Sherlock assured him he was not. The farmer nodded without further inquiry, clearly used to students performing odd tasks on university grounds. Holmes recorded his results, appreciating how much information even a partial footprint could reveal. Another experiment involved the distinctive burn patterns left by various pipe ashes. When students teased him lightly about the number of samples he collected, he remarked, with mild humour, that he found tobacco more cooperative than people it stayed where it was put, and rarely lied about its origin. This gentle remark circulated among his acquaintances, who repeated it fondly. Sherlock did not intend it as a joke, yet it captured the unintentional humour that appeared in many of his observations. His studies also intersected with cultural changes in Britain. The Victorian era fostered growing interest in scientific approaches to law enforcement. Notable advancements in fingerprint identification, chemical testing, and urban policing emerged during these years. Sherlock followed these developments with quiet enthusiasm, though he often noted that new tools were only as effective as the minds interpreting them. Tools could mislead if wielded without caution, a fact he saw reflected in several contemporary investigations reported in newspapers. He began clipping articles about unsolved or poorly solved cases, organising them meticulously in drawers using a system so personal that even Mycroft would likely have raised an eyebrow at its complexity. Despite his seriousness, his university life contained light-hearted curiosities. He once spent an afternoon analysing how ink splattered differently depending on the angle of a quill's fall. While demonstrating his findings to a friend, he accidentally created such a dramatic splatter that a passing student assumed some chaotic mishap had occurred. Sherlock calmly explained the pattern, though his explanation did little to dispel the impression that he had developed a tragic relationship with stationery. Afterward, he developed a habit of keeping a cloth nearby during such experiments. It remained folded neatly on his desk for months, rarely used but serving as a quiet token of caution. His interest in casework matured significantly when he examined a puzzling situation involving a series of petty thefts in student boarding houses. The items stolen were peculiar: a set of mismatched gloves, a half-used bottle of ink, and a brass paperweight shaped like a small lion. The pattern seemed too inconsistent for typical theft, and the students suspected a prank. Sherlock offered assistance, motivated not by the value of the items but by the oddity of the collection. He inspected the rooms where thefts occurred, noting the placement of windows, the condition of door hinges, and traces left behind by the intruder. He detected faint impressions on a windowsill mark suggesting someone had leaned heavily while climbing, but the direction of weight distribution puzzled him. It pointed inward rather than outward, implying the intruder entered through the window from the inside. That seemed nonsensical until Sherlock realised many boarding houses shared internal courtyards accessible through interconnected window ledges. The intruder had been moving between rooms without ever stepping outside. Determining the motive required a different kind of reasoning. Holmes examined the stolen items and concluded they shared a characteristic unrelated to monetary value. Each belonged to students heavily involved in theatrical clubs. He learned that the Campus Drama Society was preparing a performance and had been unable to finalise certain costumes and props. The thief turned out to be a young actor who borrowed the items hastily, intending to return them but becoming overwhelmed by rehearsals. His embarrassment had prevented him from admitting this earlier. Holmes revealed the findings gently, suggesting no malicious intent. The relief among the students replaced suspicion with mild amusement. The Drama Society returned the items and joked that Sherlock should receive honorary membership for solving a case with more theatrics than their entire production. He politely declined. While modest in scale, this incident strengthened Holmes's sense that the principles he practiced were universally applicable: observe without prejudice, reason from facts, and resist the temptation to accept the simplest explanation merely because it was convenient. Sherlock's time at university was not defined only by intellectual pursuits. It was also a period in which he honed the personal habits that later became inseparable from the detective the world imagined. For instance, he often paced while thinking, though not dramatically, just a gentle back and forth along a preferred strip of floor. Students grew accustomed to stepping aside when they saw him approaching with that distant, thoughtful look. At times he paced so consistently that the wood beneath took on a smoother sheen. After noticing this, he began varying his route to avoid wearing a visible path. The small adjustment amused him, as it felt like solving a problem he had unintentionally created. His music studies also expanded during this period. He learned violin not for performance, but because it offered a calm refuge from intense concentration. When reasoning through a complex problem, he sometimes played soft, wandering lines that helped him sort through ideas. His technique was competent, though occasionally he grew so absorbed in a thought mid-phrase that his bow drifted and produced a sound that startled listeners in adjoining rooms. One student later joked that he always knew when Sherlock's reasoning hit a barrier, because the violin suddenly emitted a tone of protest. Sherlock accepted this comment with polite neutrality, though he privately found the description fair enough. With increasing experience, Holmes developed an admiration for the scientific method. He practiced controlled reasoning, eliminating uncertain elements until only reliable facts remained. Yet he remained flexible enough to adjust his conclusions when new evidence appeared. This balance became one of his defining strengths. Instead of clinging to a theory, he let the evidence guide him. The process felt to him like tightening a series of threads, not dramatic, but deeply satisfying. One of the most formative episodes during these years involved an inquiry that reached beyond campus. A local tailor sought help after fabric deliveries repeatedly arrived damaged. The shipping company denied responsibility, claiming the crates left their facility intact. Curious about this disagreement, Sherlock agreed to inspect the materials. He studied the crates, noted the splinter patterns, and examined the fabric edges under lamplight. He discovered a subtle pattern of diagonal stress tears consistent with mechanical pressure from a shifting cart. Visiting the route between the shipping station and the tailor, Sherlock observed a narrow street with uneven paving stones. He concluded that a delivery cart, passing swiftly over the roughest stretch, likely caused the crates to bounce, compressing the fabric inside. The explanation satisfied both parties. The tailor reinforced the packaging, and the shipping company repaired the problematic route. It was one of those cases where understanding physical forces solved a problem that had grown needlessly contentious. Through such inquiries, Holmes gained confidence not in himself but in the method he trusted. He realized that practical problems often concealed small but important details, and noticing them required no theatrics, only patience. He came to believe that nearly any mystery could be understood if one resisted the lure of assumptions. As he progressed toward the end of his university years, Sherlock began feeling the faint pull of the world beyond academic settings. The campus had nurtured his talents, but he sensed that remaining there indefinitely would confine rather than expand his abilities. He wanted to enter environments where observations carried consequences, where answers mattered not just for intellectual satisfaction but for real situations. Without announcing any grand decision, he simply prepared himself quietly. He organized his notebooks, refined his methods, and continued practicing skills he believed would serve him well. And gradually, he shifted from curious student to someone on the edge of a new profession, not yet a consulting detective, but already thinking like one, working like one, and finding meaning in the careful recognition of truth. His talents, once scattered across interests, were beginning to align, and though he did not yet know how they would shape his life, he felt a steady sense of direction forming one grounded not in ambition, but in the natural progression of a mind built to understand the world through careful, patient inquiry. Meeting Dr. Watson. Sherlock Holmes's steady pattern of small but precise investigations soon widened into work that crossed new social circles. London, with its mixture of professionals, students, soldiers, merchants, and wanderers of every sort, offered a constant shifting of acquaintances. Holmes often encountered individuals whose paths brushed his own for a moment before drifting away again. Yet one meeting during this period developed not through planned intention but through simple circumstance, the sort of ordinary arrangement that happened frequently in the city when lodgings and economies encouraged shared spaces. It occurred in a modest building in Marylebone, a district known for its blend of quiet streets and practical accommodations. Holmes had been seeking new rooms that could serve both as a residence and a workplace for his growing collection of investigative materials. His previous lodgings, though adequate, offered little room for expanding boxes of samples and notebooks. He preferred a space with good lighting, a practical layout, and enough floor area to conduct experiments without rearranging furniture too often. An acquaintance at St. Bartholomew's Hospital mentioned a set of rooms available for shared rent. The arrangement appealed to Holmes's sensible approach to finances, and he agreed to view the property. The building stood on a street where cab wheels left shallow grooves in the pavement and where morning deliveries produced a gentle clatter rather than overwhelming noise. Holmes entered the rooms with an immediate interest in their structure. The sitting room had broad windows facing the street, allowing excellent natural light during the early hours. The fireplace appeared sturdy, suitable for heating in winter. Shelves lined one wall, leaving ample space for his materials. He inspected the floorboards for stability and the chimneypiece for signs of draughts. The arrangement suited him well. The landlady mentioned that another prospective tenant planned to view the rooms shortly. Holmes accepted this without concern, assuming that if the prospective tenant proved incompatible, the landlady would continue searching. A short while later, a man of modest frame entered the sitting room with the careful gait of someone recovering from prolonged strain. This was Dr. John Watson, recently returned from military service abroad. His experiences had left him with lingering weakness, but a desire to re-establish a practical life in London. He surveyed the rooms thoughtfully, assessing the layout with the eye of someone who valued comfort and stability. Holmes observed the steady, deliberate way Watson examined the fireplace and noted the slight favouring of one leg, indicating an older injury rather than a recent one. He noticed the doctor's measured breathing, suggesting he paced his movements to avoid fatigue. These details offered a straightforward impression. Watson approached situations with calm rationality, preferring clarity over grand gestures. The landlady introduced the two men, mentioning that they might consider sharing the rooms to reduce costs. They exchanged a simple acknowledgement, neither offering immediate enthusiasm nor reservations beyond practical questions about rent, heating, and available space. Holmes inquired whether Watson required quiet during certain hours for rest or study. Watson asked whether Holmes worked with volatile chemicals. Holmes admitted that he occasionally used reagents but handled them with care. Watson nodded, appearing satisfied. They agreed to the arrangement because it suited both their needs. Watson required economical lodging near medical circles. Holmes needed space with good lighting and room for experiments. Their partnership began without fanfare, shaped entirely by circumstance and practicality. Holmes moved in first, organising his materials with steady precision. He arranged his chemical supplies on a shelf according to volatility, placed his notebooks on a writing desk, and set his violin near the window where he sometimes played in the evenings. Watson arrived soon afterward, bringing medical texts, a modest trunk of clothing, and an assortment of small items accumulated during travel. He placed his belongings neatly, adjusting to the new environment with the ease of someone accustomed to adapting to changing circumstances. Sharing rooms required a simple understanding of daily habits. Holmes tended to rise early when the morning light entered through the windows. Watson's schedule fluctuated depending on his health and his attempts to re-engage with professional contacts. Holmes kept the sitting room tidy enough for combined use, though he occasionally left a scientific instrument on the table, which Watson placed gently aside when reading. Watson organised his medical notes near one corner of the desk, but left the majority of the workspace available for Holmes's examinations. During these early weeks of cohabitation, Watson witnessed Holmes's methods firsthand. Holmes spent long hours studying various materials, examining fibres, ashes, soils, inks, and handwriting samples. He conducted quiet experiments using small burners, vials, and reagents. He often worked silently, occasionally making a notation in a notebook or adjusting an instrument with deliberate movements. Watson observed without intrusion, recognizing that Holmes's concentration was steady rather than intense. The sitting room environment supported both their routines. Holmes occasionally received visitors seeking his assistance. A clerk arrived with a damaged document requiring analysis. Holmes compared the paper fibres and provided a measured report. A shopkeeper asked about a recurring transport problem. Holmes offered a straightforward assessment. Watson gradually realized that the cases Holmes accepted ranged from trivial to moderately complex, but always involved matters requiring careful observation. None of these visitors behaved as though they were consulting a publicized figure. They simply valued Holmes's precision. One late afternoon, Watson noticed Holmes examining the heel of a walking stick brought to him by a solicitor. Holmes measured the angle of the scratches with a small ruler. The scene contained nothing dramatic. The solicitor waited patiently, occasionally sipping tea. Holmes made several quiet notes and explained that the wear pattern indicated improper storage rather than tampering. The solicitor accepted the explanation, thanked Holmes, and departed. Watson found the entire exchange striking for its simplicity. Holmes rarely discussed conclusions in sweeping terms. His explanations remained factual, grounded in physical evidence. Watson's presence introduced a new dimension to their shared environment. While Holmes worked, Watson read medical journals, wrote letters, or organised his notes. Their companionship developed from parallel activity rather than conversation. They respected one another's spaces naturally. Holmes appreciated Watson's calm manner. Watson appreciated Holmes's consistency. A small quirk appeared one morning when Holmes attempted to prepare breakfast during Watson's absence. He assembled a tray with modest precision bread, butter, and a pot of tea. Yet he became distracted by a sample of mineral dust he had been studying before breakfast. By the time he returned to the tray, he realized he had buttered the same slice of bread 3 times and left the others untouched. When Watson returned later, Holmes mentioned the oversight with mild detachment. Watson simply nodded, accustomed to similar incidents in the medical field when professionals grew absorbed in thought. The moment passed without humour made explicit, yet it gave a window into how Holmes's concentration sometimes interfered with simple tasks. Their partnership gained steadiness as weeks passed. Watson's health improved gradually, supported by predictable meals and quiet surroundings. He took daily walks, occasionally accompanied by Holmes when the latter wished to observe city conditions. Holmes studied footprints, carriage tracks, and street patterns. Watson listened attentively, not because he doubted Holmes's conclusions, but because the observations provided a useful understanding of London's neighbourhoods. Several new cases arrived during this period. One involved a gentleman perplexed by recurring stains on his coat sleeves. Holmes examined the fabric, traced the pattern of the stains, and identified contact with a newly varnished railing the man leaned against each morning while reading the newspaper. Another case concerned a tobacconist whose shop displayed faint scorch marks on one shelf. Holmes determined the marks came from a lantern placed too close during nighttime cleaning. Holmes explained the cause calmly. The tobacconist adjusted his routine. A more substantial matter involved a bookseller in Bloomsbury, who noticed that several ledgers displayed faint impressions of handwriting not present on their visible surfaces. Holmes studied the indentations and determined they resulted from pressure applied during storage rather than intentional tampering. He reconstructed the pattern by examining how stacks shifted under weight. The bookseller replaced the storage method accordingly. Watson observed these inquiries not as narrative episodes, but as ordinary elements of Holmes's work. He soon learned that Holmes approached all cases with consistent procedure. First, he examined the environment. Then, he studied the materials directly. Finally, he presented an explanation without exaggeration. Watson found the approach reliable and easy to follow. Other inquiries required more time. A tailor suspected theft of measuring tapes. Holmes visited the shop, examined the workstations, and found the tapes had slipped into a gap between two counters due to frequent vibration from a nearby press. The tailor retrieved them readily. Another case involved a jeweller convinced that a customer had returned a different ring than the one purchased. Holmes compared microscopic scratches along the interior and confirmed the ring was the same. The jeweller accepted this calmly. Their shared rooms at Baker Street grew into a steady base of operations. The sitting room held Holmes's instruments, Watson's books, and several boxes arranged in orderly fashion. Holmes kept soil samples in small containers labelled by district. Watson organised medical charts in folders. They respected one another's materials without needing formal discussions about boundaries. Holmes developed a habit of using a corner of the room for storing boots from various districts to study wear patterns. Watson, noticing the accumulation, placed a modest rack nearby to maintain order. Holmes accepted the rack and used it without comment. It prevented stray boots from appearing under chairs, which Watson appreciated. As Watson resumed broader contact with medical colleagues, he occasionally introduced Holmes to professionals who encountered unusual problems. One doctor received inconsistent readings from a particular thermometer. Holmes examined the device and found a faint crack in the glass near the base, affecting mercury movement. Another inquiry involved a missing medical instrument later found among laundry, after Holmes traced a series of fabric impressions to its outline. Watson's understanding of Holmes deepened not through explicit explanation, but through steady exposure to his methods. He saw how Holmes calibrated instruments, how he stored materials, and how he adjusted lighting for certain tasks. Holmes preferred natural light for examining samples, but used a lamp with adjustable height for detailed work. Watson once observed him adjusting the flame with remarkable precision, lowering it until a faint gleam struck a set of glass vials. Holmes studied the reflections for consistency, nodding slightly when satisfied. Watson also noticed Holmes's careful organisation of time. Holmes often kept multiple investigations underway simultaneously. He shifted among them easily, attending to each when conditions suited it. If a soil sample required drying, he used the waiting period to analyse handwriting or examine fibres. Watson found the efficiency practical rather than rushed. Visitors continued arriving. A railway clerk sought help with mislabelled cargo records. Holmes compared handwriting styles and identified a clerical assistant whose writing varied under cold conditions. A shop assistant asked about recurring damage to fabric bolts. Holmes traced the problem to a misaligned metal bracket on a storage rack. Each case concluded with a direct explanation and a simple remedy. Holmes also accepted inquiries requiring minimal travel. He visited a warehouse near the docks where crates displayed faint streaks of oil. Inspecting the arrangement, he found that condensation from pipes above caused the streaks. Adjusting the insulation solved the issue. He visited a household concerned about unusual tapping noises near the pantry. He located a loose section of water piping that produced sound when air pressure fluctuated. The household made repairs accordingly. During this time, Holmes encountered a case involving a misdelivered parcel. The postal worker responsible insisted the address had been clear. Holmes examined the handwriting and the way ink pooled near certain strokes. He identified moisture interference during writing, which altered the intended number. The explanation satisfied the involved parties. Watson observed the clarity of Holmes's analysis without commentary. Another matter brought Holmes to a photography studio, experiencing unusual shadows on developed prints. He inspected the developing room and found a small gap in the shading curtain. Adjusting the curtain resolved the problem. The photographer expressed relief. Holmes returned to Baker Street carrying a curiosity the photographer gave him, a small magnifying glass used for examining negatives. Holmes placed it with his tools, appreciating its practical use. Holmes continued to investigate varied issues quietly. A clerk misplaced ledger keys. Holmes found them under loose floorboards. A shop owner noticed inconsistent cash counting. Holmes traced it to minor arithmetic errors rather than misconduct. A messenger worried about strange patterns on his envelopes. Holmes linked the marks to ink drying inconsistently due to weather conditions. Watson observed these inquiries from the edge of the room while maintaining his own work. One case extended longer than most. A shipping office reported discrepancies in crate inventories. Holmes visited the warehouse, studied the arrangement, and found that certain crates were recorded twice inadvertently when workers moved them between rooms. He adjusted the tracking method to prevent repetition. The office manager accepted the solution. As the months passed, Holmes and Watson developed practical routines that supported their respective professions. They shared the sitting room in the evenings, sometimes reading in silence. Holmes adjusted his experiments to avoid intrusion into Watson's space. Watson kept medical equipment organised to prevent interference with Holmes's investigations. The city around them continued its usual activity, markets opening at dawn, trains passing through stations, newspapers reporting daily events. Holmes used the city as a wide laboratory, gathering observations from each district he visited. Watson joined occasionally, following Holmes's steps with steady interest. Holmes maintained his notebooks carefully, filling page after page with factual entries, measurements, observations, materials, timings, and conditions. Watson filled his journals with medical notes and case histories. Their work progressed independently, yet comfortably parallel. There was no sudden shift in their partnership. It developed evenly as they lived and worked together, both benefiting from the arrangement. And through this steady rhythm, Holmes continued receiving inquiries, each requiring the same calm, consistent application of method and evidence. London as their stage. London, in the late 19th century, offered Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson a setting with constant activity, but also countless small details that rewarded patient attention. The city changed character from one district to another. Narrow lanes where cartwheels pressed deep into damp mud, broad avenues with polished stone reflecting morning light, arcades filled with shopkeepers arranging displays, and railway stations sending steam upward in drifting columns. Holmes walked through these areas with an accuracy of observation that made the city feel like a vast workbook. Watson joined him frequently, partly for the exercise recommended by his doctors, and partly because London's shifting scenes offered steady interest without demanding more effort from him than he could manage. Holmes moved with a sense of purpose even when he had no specific case at hand. He often adjusted his route depending on what he wished to examine. If he wanted to study how fog settled along the riverfront, he walked toward the Thames at dawn. If he wished to watch how crowds moved during business hours, he visited the areas surrounding the Bank of England. If he needed quieter surroundings to test how sound carried across narrow streets, he went to older sections of the city where brick buildings formed tall corridors that captured and redirected footsteps. Watson followed at a comfortable pace, occasionally taking note of Holmes's tendency to pause mid-stride whenever a detail caught his attention. One morning, they stopped near a row of market stalls in Covent Garden. Holmes observed the manner in which vendors assembled their tables, noting that fruit sellers tended to arrange their goods in sloping layers while flower sellers preferred neat clusters. He examined the ground and noticed faint imprints from crates moved earlier before the stalls opened. The patterns suggested which vendors arrived first and how often they shifted their setups. Watson found this ordinary information unexpectedly grounding. The market hummed around them, and Holmes treated the entire area as a living diagram. Their presence in London soon brought more varied inquiries. The city's businesses, households, and small institutions often encountered puzzles too minor for police intervention but too disruptive to ignore. Holmes stepped into these situations with straightforward reasoning. One case involved a small theatre experiencing repeated trouble with props missing or appearing in the wrong backstage locations. The stage manager expected mischief among performers. Holmes visited during afternoon rehearsal, walked calmly along the backstage corridors, and inspected the storage areas. The misplaced props bore faint scuff marks consistent with being brushed aside by carts used to transport scenery pieces. He traced the pattern to a particular corner where two crews often crossed paths. Once the crews adjusted their staging routes, the confusion ended. The theatre thanked Holmes and offered free seats to their next production, which Watson accepted, though Holmes remained largely indifferent to performances, unless they contained interesting technical effects. Another inquiry arrived from a bakery owner concerned about inconsistent rise in bread batches. Holmes examined the ovens and found that the heat source varied depending on how ash was cleared each morning. He advised a different cleaning method that produced even temperatures. The baker adjusted his routine, and the problems ceased. Watson found this case especially satisfying because the bakery began sending them fresh rolls occasionally. Holmes accepted them politely, although he tended to forget about baked goods until Watson placed them directly within reach. London's diverse industries brought Holmes into contact with craftsmen of every sort. A leatherworker noticed that certain pieces developed unexpected stiffness. Holmes examined the tanning solution used in the workshop and found that a new supplier introduced a slightly different mixture that reacted poorly with damp air on foggy days. Once the workshop adjusted storage conditions, the leather improved. A clockmaker reported unusual ticking irregularities. Holmes discovered that dust carried in from a nearby renovation project interfered with the delicate gears. Simple solutions followed each finding. Holmes continued to catalogue details about London itself. He learned which districts had cobblestones that wore down quickly and left distinct chips on boot heels. He noted which neighbourhoods experienced frequent fluctuations in gas pressure, causing street lamps to flicker. Watson occasionally saw him pause near a lamppost or stairway and kneel to examine a detail too small for most passers-by to notice. The city had become, for Holmes, an extended laboratory. A case from this era involved a printer who produced pamphlets for political societies. The printer worried that someone tampered with his ink supply because certain pamphlets displayed faint blotches. Holmes tested the ink on different papers and identified humidity as the true cause. A nearby leak in the workshop roof allowed moisture to settle on freshly printed sheets. Once the leak was repaired, the printing stabilized. Holmes accepted payment in the form of high-quality blank paper, which he used extensively for notes and handwriting studies. Not all inquiries were straightforward. One merchant reported that crates in his warehouse shifted slightly overnight, leading him to suspect trespassers. Holmes visited the warehouse in the late afternoon to examine its structure. He noticed the building rested on uneven ground that subtly settled on certain nights when cargo weight changed. The shift produced faint movements among stacked crates. By reorganizing the stacks, the merchant eliminated the issue. Watson watched Holmes evaluate the warehouse floor with mild interest, noting how Holmes could separate structural behavior from human behavior without treating either as more significant than the other. Another situation involved a library experiencing troubling misalignment in its shelving. Books leaned at odd angles, worrying the librarian. Holmes inspected the shelves and found the problem originated from metal brackets installed only halfway into the supporting beams. Over time, the brackets loosened, causing the shelves to tilt. A carpenter corrected the installation, and the library returned to order. The librarian expressed gratitude by offering Holmes access to older archives normally restricted to researchers. Holmes accepted and spent several afternoons studying older case reports and foreign treatises on evidence analysis. Holmes's connection to London widened further when Watson introduced him to acquaintances from medical and military circles. One doctor sought help identifying why certain instruments rusted despite proper cleaning. Holmes examined the instruments and found microscopic scratches caused by an abrasive cleaning cloth. Replacing the cloth prevented further wear. A veteran reported inconsistencies in the locking mechanism of his walking cane. Holmes determined the culprit to be a manufacturing defect and suggested a simple replacement. Holmes showed an enduring interest in how materials interacted with London's environment. He studied soot accumulation on window frames in different districts and compared the patterns. He tested how quickly rainwater evaporated on paving stones, noting differences according to the density of foot traffic. Watson occasionally observed Holmes checking his pocket watch while observing a puddle, a sight that puzzled passers-by but made sense to Watson after several explanations. One of the more interesting cases during this period involved an engraver whose tools dulled unexpectedly. Holmes visited the engraver's workshop and inspected the workbench. He noticed fine metal dust scattered unevenly. Observing the engraver's routine, he discovered that a new apprentice polished tools using an inconsistent method that wore them down prematurely. Once corrected, the tools lasted much longer. The engraver offered Holmes a small engraved plate as thanks, which Holmes kept among his assorted curiosities. Holmes and Watson established a habit of evening walks during this time. Watson benefited from the exercise, and Holmes used the quieter hours to observe the city when noise levels dropped. Street lamps cast steady pools of light, and the patterns of carriage wheels left distinct marks on the damp ground. Holmes pointed out differences between fresh and older tracks, drawing attention to subtle variations in depth and shape. Watson listened without needing to interpret meaning beyond simple observation. Another case reached Holmes through a pawnbroker confused by a series of mismatched item descriptions. Certain objects described on intake slips did not align with the items later retrieved. Holmes compared the handwriting of intake records and found that a single employee's writing changed noticeably during midday, likely due to fatigue. Adjusting the employee's schedule resolved the issue, preventing further errors. Holmes's work continued at a pace that filled his days without overwhelming them. He managed inquiries that varied widely in scope. A small tailor concerned about inconsistent stitch tension sought help. Holmes traced the issue to a slightly misaligned tension wheel on the tailor's machine. A schoolteacher noticed odd residue on students' boots. Holmes found the cause in a recently resurfaced courtyard. Holmes also gained familiarity with London's postal routes. He studied how letters travelled between districts and how delays occurred. One inquiry from a solicitor involved misplaced correspondence. Holmes traced the issue to a sorting error caused by a worn marking on a distribution bag. Once identified, the postal station corrected the label. Holmes kept the worn marking as a sample of ink erosion on fabric. Throughout this era, Holmes maintained his methods with consistent attention. He recorded each case in orderly notes, describing materials involved, environmental factors, and steps taken. Watson, observing this, recognized that Holmes approached each matter with the same calm precision regardless of its importance. Holmes treated a damaged shoelace with the same care as a crate discrepancy. Holmes occasionally used household items for impromptu experiments without mentioning it. Once, Watson discovered his shaving mug filled with a solution Holmes used to test mineral residue. Holmes apologized mildly, explaining that the mug had an ideal curvature for the test. Watson later placed a spare mug in the bathroom labelled, "For experiments only," a small arrangement that prevented future confusion. The city continued to serve as an endless resource. Holmes visited stations to study the spacing of rail ties, workshops to observe the cooling patterns of metal, and storefronts to examine how lighting altered product appearance. He observed carriage horses' hoof marks, identifying how shoes wore down differently depending on district terrain. Watson occasionally asked brief questions, which Holmes answered with clear explanations. In one inquiry, a shopkeeper noticed recurring cracks in his storefront window. Holmes examined the fractures and found them consistent with temperature stress from a nearby stove. Another case concerned a tobacconist troubled by uneven humidity in his storage area. Holmes traced the issue to a gap in the window frame. A school experienced repeated chalk breakage. Holmes identified inconsistent drying of newly delivered chalk sticks. Holmes accepted each case with measured interest. No matter how mundane, each presented a structure he could examine. Watson observed how Holmes approached objects gently, rarely disrupting their original state. He turned items slowly, measured distances calmly, and recorded observations without haste. A more involved matter brought Holmes to a paper manufacturer dealing with irregular grain patterns. Examining the pulp mixture, Holmes traced the inconsistency to seasonal variations in water sourced from a nearby stream. Adjusting the filtration process corrected the issue. The manufacturer appreciated the clarity of Holmes's approach and offered continued collaboration. By this stage, Holmes and Watson formed a reliable rhythm. They shared rooms without friction, conducted their respective work, and navigated London with familiarity. The city's districts became reference points for Holmes's investigations, each location offering specific patterns he could use as comparison. His knowledge of London's layout, materials, and conditions grew steadily through countless observations. Investigations continued without pause. A misaligned hinge in a locksmith's cabinet, a faulty pulley in a workshop, a cracked tile revealing moisture seepage in a residence. Holmes addressed each efficiently. Watson occasionally assisted by holding instruments or taking notes when needed. Through this period, Holmes's work relied on the structure the city provided. London offered an endless sequence of daily puzzles, each rooted in physical evidence, environmental influence, or routine human behaviour. Holmes approached these steadily, allowing the city to supply new material day after day. Methods and habits. Sherlock Holmes's routines became more defined as his work expanded across London. His habits grew not from deliberate design but from repeated use of methods that proved reliable. He arranged his days according to the type of work requiring attention. Mornings often began with reading newspapers spread neatly across the sitting room table. He scanned reports for unusual details, small notes about industrial accidents, lost property announcements, shipping delays, or odd occurrences that editors included without commentary. He read quietly, turning each page with steady precision. Watson frequently joined him, reading medical articles or letters from colleagues while Holmes continued his survey of daily events. Holmes did not treat the news as entertainment. He viewed it as an extension of the city itself, a written record of patterns occurring in different districts. He noted changes in weather that might influence certain materials, fluctuations in business activity, and emerging technologies. He kept a notebook nearby and recorded details that might later help explain a case, such as a report about new street cleaning equipment that left distinct residue on pavements. These entries formed a growing catalogue of references he could consult when needed. His methods extended far beyond reading. Holmes maintained several workstations within their sitting room. One corner held instruments for chemical analysis, small burners, vials, labelled powders, and reagents arranged in orderly rows. Another area contained samples of tobacco ash categorized by origin. Nearby, shelves held soil specimens collected from numerous locations around London. Holmes used these specimens frequently, applying them to inquiries about footprints, boot wear, or environmental contamination. Watson observed that Holmes rarely allowed clutter, though his definition of order differed from ordinary housekeeping standards. Items rested in fixed positions that Holmes could identify instantly. Watson learned quickly not to shift anything unless necessary. Holmes developed a particular method for examining handwriting. He kept multiple magnifying devices, small lenses, larger glasses, and specialized tools gifted by craftsmen. He compared line quality, ink flow, pressure distribution, and the subtle rise or fall of strokes. He often used angled light to highlight indentations left by writing instruments. Watson, watching this process, noticed that Holmes handled samples with the same gentleness a surgeon used when examining delicate tissue. The comparison suited the calmness of Holmes's movements, though Watson did not mention it aloud. Holmes also set aside time for physical observation outdoors. He studied how boot soles wore down over different surfaces, how drays left marks depending on load weight, and how soot settled on building facades. He walked with measured steps, pausing when he encountered something worth examining: an imprint in wet soil, a scratch along a brick wall, or a discarded object. Watson often waited beside him patiently. These pauses never lasted long, unless the detail required deeper study. His violin practice played a role in his routine as well. He used music as a way to divide periods of concentrated work. After finishing a complex analysis, he picked up the violin and played a series of slow, unadorned phrases. The sound filled the sitting room with steady resonance, neither dramatic nor melancholy. On occasion, Holmes interrupted a phrase abruptly when a new idea occurred to him. The abrupt shift produced a short, sharp sound that startled Watson the first few times. Watson eventually grew accustomed to these sudden breaks and continued reading without comment. Holmes's approach to problem-solving involved close attention to physical materials. He examined walls for traces of moisture, floorboards for shifts in pressure, metal objects for patterns of oxidation, and fabrics for thread irregularities. When individuals sought his assistance, he often carried a small kit containing essential tools: a lens, measuring tape, tweezers, scraps of test paper, and a few vials for collecting samples. He used these items unobtrusively, often finishing examinations before onlookers realized he had begun. Although Holmes maintained consistent methods, he occasionally demonstrated quirks. One involved his habit of placing small markers, tiny slips of paper, or chalk dots near objects he intended to monitor. These markers helped him detect movement, drafts, or vibration. Watson once discovered a chalk dot on the edge of his medical text. Holmes had placed it there accidentally while arranging markers for a separate case. When Watson pointed it out, Holmes apologized in his unassuming manner and added that the dot had served its purpose even though it appeared in an unintended location. Holmes's reputation among tradespeople grew steadily. Carpenters, engravers, shop owners and clerks sought his assistance for issues too small to involve authorities but too puzzling to ignore. One printer invited Holmes to examine recurring smudges in his shop ledger. Holmes inspected the ink, paper texture, and pressure marks. He found that the smudges originated from residual ink on a binding press that workers cleaned inconsistently. Once corrected, the smudges vanished. Another case involved a jeweller whose velvet display pads developed faint depressions. Holmes identified the cause: a subtle flaw in the padding material that compacted unevenly under repeated pressure. A more involved matter arose from a fabric merchant whose bolts of cloth displayed irregular dye absorption. Holmes examined the textiles, the dye mixtures, and the drying racks. He traced the inconsistency to uneven airflow caused by a recently installed partition wall. The merchant adjusted the layout, and the dye absorption stabilized. Holmes accepted a spool of fine thread as thanks, finding it useful for future measurements. Holmes's habits extended to nighttime study. He often used a desk lamp with adjustable height to examine small objects. He positioned the lamp precisely, aligning its light to reveal textures or scratches. Watson occasionally saw him shifting the lamp by fractions of an inch until the illumination suited his needs. Once satisfied, Holmes worked quietly, turning objects slowly to observe them from multiple angles. His interest in materials prompted him to conduct experiments using controlled conditions. He compared how ink dried on paper from different suppliers, how chalk broke depending on moisture content, and how dust accumulated near various ventilation openings. He organized the results in notebook tables. Watson sometimes found sketches of boot tread patterns or diagrams showing the angle of scratches on brass fixtures. Holmes stored these diagrams carefully, referring to them when similar cases appeared. Holmes sometimes carried a string he used to measure spacing quickly. One afternoon, Watson found him comparing the length of a bookshelf to the distance between two windows using this string. Holmes explained the measurement calmly, stating it helped him understand airflow patterns in the room. Watson nodded, recognizing that Holmes's logic, while unconventional at times, always followed a clear line. Cases continued arriving. A tobacconist requested analysis of uneven burn patterns in cigars. Holmes determined the variation arose from inconsistent leaf thickness in a particular batch. A shoemaker asked about recurring creases on certain boots. Holmes traced the issue to a flawed batch of leather. A shipping clerk sought help after cargo records displayed inconsistencies. Holmes identified a clerical duplication error caused by repeated transcriptions of the same entry. One intricate case came from a glass blower whose finished pieces developed faint stress lines. Holmes visited the workshop, inspected the cooling process, and examined the placement of newly shaped glass. He discovered that drafts from an open side window caused uneven temperature distribution. Adjusting the workspace eliminated the stress lines. The glass blower, relieved, offered Holmes a small glass sphere as a token. Holmes placed the sphere on their mantel, where it refracted light into mild prismatic streaks during sunny mornings. Holmes's habits included studying sound as well. He tested how footsteps differed across wooden, tile and stone surfaces. He noted how far voices carried under varying atmospheric conditions. He once paced their sitting room with a metronome in hand to time echo intervals. Watson watched this scene with quiet amusement. Holmes completed the study without acknowledging its unusual appearance, recording the figures neatly afterward. Watson also noticed that Holmes categorized tobacco ash with exceptional care. He maintained rows of glass tubes labeled by origin: Eastern blends, Western imports, London mixtures, and handcrafted varieties. Holmes often compared new samples to this catalogue, shaking the tubes lightly to observe how ash settled. Watson occasionally asked brief questions, receiving direct explanations about grain consistency or burn residue. Holmes also studied wear patterns in personal items. When a clerk brought him a damaged pocket watch, Holmes observed the hinge, the chain, and the case interior. He determined the damage resulted from repeated contact with a metal clasp in the clerk's coat pocket. The clerk replaced the clasp and experienced no further issues. Holmes recorded the case as an example of mechanical interference rather than structural flaw. One especially detailed inquiry came from a legal office troubled by inconsistent impressions on wax seals. Holmes examined the seals and found small air pockets caused by temperature variations in the sealing wax. He traced the issue to a draft in the office corridor. Moving the sealing station resolved the problem. The office manager sent Holmes a box of sealing wax as thanks. Holmes stored it among his materials, labelling each stick by melting point. Holmes refined his methods for studying fibres as well. He compared wool, cotton, linen and silk samples under varied lighting. He observed how fibres frayed under pressure and how dyes adhered differently. He once placed a length of thread between two books to test tension effects over time. Watson discovered the books clamped around the thread and asked about the experiment. Holmes replied simply, describing the test without embellishment. Holmes also maintained a habit of sketching diagrams of objects he studied. His sketches lacked artistic flair but conveyed structure clearly. He drew the curvature of broken metal, the angle of scratches on wood, and the arrangement of crates in warehouses. Watson occasionally found these sketches tucked into books or pinned to the wall near Holmes's workstation. He measured the distance between strides of pedestrians in various districts, noting differences based on ground texture. Once, while timing steps along a quiet street, he continued following the same pace long enough that a passerby assumed he was performing a demonstration. Holmes completed his measurements without responding to the curious looks. Holmes's habits extended to studying public transportation as well. He observed the markings left by horse trams, noting how wheel grooves varied depending on load weight. He compared the difference between fresh and dried mud on carriage wheels. He once collected mud from a wheel hub and stored it in a labelled jar, later adding it to his catalogue of soil specimens. Challenges continued appearing. A cooper noticed his barrels developed uneven swelling. Holmes studied the wood grain and found that the staves came from trees grown in different soil conditions, causing varied absorption rates. A shoemaker worried about inconsistently worn soles. Holmes linked the issue to uneven cobblestones outside the shop. A clock tower keeper sought help after the tower's chimes sounded irregular. Holmes inspected the gears and traced the disruption to a build-up of dust near a pivot. Holmes also maintained a disciplined approach to time. He checked his pocket watch at regular intervals during experiments, recording durations precisely. Watson sometimes saw him adjusting his watch against the clock at the post office, preferring accuracy in all measurements. Holmes treated time as an essential tool, not an abstraction. His methods expanded with experience. He created reference charts for material hardness, diagrams for common footprint treads, and tables showing ink viscosity under varying humidity. Watson observed that Holmes rarely discarded old notes, preferring to store them for potential use. The shelves of their sitting room gradually filled with labelled boxes and folders, arranged according to Holmes's internal system. Holmes continued to examine cases for individuals across the city. A stationer sought help identifying the cause of faint indentations on writing paper. Holmes traced them to stacking pressure during shipment. A milliner noticed discoloration on hat bands. Holmes identified contact with a metal surface that oxidized under moisture. A grocer reported inconsistencies in weighing produce. Holmes discovered a scale misalignment. Through these activities, Holmes advanced his method steadily, applying the same calm attention to cases involving household objects or industrial equipment. His work remained grounded in physical evidence, scratches, fibres, stains, impressions, sounds, and measurements. His habits supported this work without ceremony, cataloguing, testing, observing, organising, and occasionally repurposing items from the household when their properties suited a particular study. When Watson occasionally teased him about using the sugar bowl to test refractive angles of liquid, Holmes accepted the comment calmly and returned the bowl to its place after cleaning it thoroughly. Watson later replaced the bowl with two identical ones, placing a note on one that read, "For tea only." Holmes used the correct one thereafter. Holmes's days followed this structure consistently. Morning reading, midday inquiries, afternoon examinations, and evening study or music. No single case dominated his efforts, but each contributed new material for his growing system of methods and habits. The city supplied constant variation, and Holmes applied his tools with unfaltering steadiness. Notable early cases. Requests for Sherlock Holmes's assistance grew steadily as Londoners discovered the value of precise, methodical examination. His work continued without flourish, a steady procession of puzzles involving objects, places, and routines. Some matters required only a brief look, while others involved several days of quiet observation. Watson watched these developments from their shared rooms at Baker Street, noting how clients arrived with uncertainty and left with clear explanations. Holmes managed each case with the same calm discipline, whether it involved a misplaced household item or a problem affecting an entire workshop. One of the more detailed early cases involved a pawnbroker troubled by inconsistent valuations of silver items. Several pieces arrived tarnished in unusual patterns, leading him to suspect deliberate tampering. Holmes examined the items with steady concentration. The tarnish appeared in clustered patches, not consistent with aging or chemical exposure. Holmes traced the pattern to cloth bags the pawnbroker used when transporting items to a cleaning facility. The cloth had been stored near a source of mild fumes from a metal polishing workshop. These fumes caused tarnish to form in irregular clusters. The pawnbroker adjusted his storage arrangement, preventing further damage. Holmes received a small silver-plated magnifying disc as thanks, which he placed among his tools. Another inquiry came from an engraver whose workbench displayed faint scratches inconsistent with his tools. Holmes visited the workshop and inspected the bench surface. He noticed the scratches followed a diagonal direction that matched no engraver's technique. He examined the bench's underside and found that one supporting leg had shifted slightly, causing the surface to tilt during work. The tilt allowed small metal filings to slide in consistent patterns, creating the scratches. Realigning the bench eliminated the issue. The engraver offered Holmes a finely etched metal plate illustrating different tool marks, a resource Holmes kept for studying future cases. Holmes also accepted a request from a librarian puzzled by recurring misplacement of certain volumes. The books in question always appeared on shelves that did not match their catalogue classification. Holmes examined the shelving patterns and discovered that a volunteer assistant arranged books by height when reshelving quickly after reading hours. The assistant's method produced tidy shelves but disrupted catalogue order. Once the librarian adjusted training procedures, the problem vanished. Holmes returned home with a list of rare texts the librarian recommended for his research, several of which he borrowed for study. A more involved case came through a solicitor whose office experienced subtle but persistent disturbances in the arrangement of documents. Papers shifted positions overnight, leading the staff to suspect tampering. Holmes visited the office after hours and studied the conditions carefully. He placed small markers along the edges of desks and cabinets, then returned the following morning. The markers revealed slight shifts caused by drafts from an upstairs window left open during warm nights. These drafts passed through the stairwell and created faint air currents strong enough to move loose papers. The solicitor adjusted the ventilation arrangement, and the disturbances ceased. Holmes's skill in categorizing tobacco ash proved useful in several inquiries. One client, a merchant, discovered burn marks on fabric samples stored in his warehouse. Holmes examined the ash pattern near the burns and identified a specific type of tobacco commonly used by dock workers in the area. Inspection of the warehouse revealed that workers resting during breaks occasionally smoked near open crates, unaware of stray embers. The merchant established a designated break area, eliminating further issues. Another inquiry came from a jeweller concerned about tiny fractures in gemstone settings. Holmes examined the fractures under a lens and compared them to his catalogue of metal stress patterns. He identified the cause as a new cleaning solution introduced by the workshop, which reacted with certain alloys. Adjusting the formula prevented further damage. The jeweller sent Holmes a small polishing cloth of exceptional quality, which Holmes used frequently when handling metal objects. Watson accompanied Holmes on numerous visits during this period. He observed how Holmes collected small samples, used his lens to examine surfaces, and recorded observations with quiet efficiency. Holmes's explanations remained factual and concise, focusing on physical causes rather than speculation. Clients appreciated his clarity. One case that drew Watson's particular interest involved a chemist who noticed recurring contamination in powdered substances. Holmes examined the contamination patterns and found that the fine dust originated from a ventilation grate above the mixing table. The grate collected residue from a soot-producing heater on the building's roof. Each time the ventilation system activated, small particles settled into the powders. Cleaning the system resolved the issue. The chemist thanked Holmes with a set of high-grade test tubes, which Holmes stored with his instruments. Holmes handled an inquiry from a bookbinder whose freshly bound volumes developed slight rippling along the edges. Holmes inspected the binding area and found that moisture from a nearby cooling vat drifted into the workspace during certain hours. Adjusting the vat's ventilation prevented the rippling. The bookbinder gave Holmes a bound notebook with durable covers, which Holmes later filled with diagrams of tool marks. One case took Holmes and Watson to the outskirts of the city. A farmer noticed irregular tracks across a field, believing trespassers had crossed at night. Holmes studied the patterns and identified them as marks left by a mechanical device used by a neighbouring farm to aerate soil. The neighbour transported the device occasionally, leaving the tracks. The farmer, relieved, adjusted his fencing to avoid future confusion. Another case involved a bank troubled by indentations in wax seals on important documents. Holmes examined the seals and found impressions caused by minor variations in temperature on the storage shelf. He recommended moving the documents to an interior cabinet, resolving the problem. Holmes continued to receive cases from artisans and small businesses. A carpenter requested help identifying cracks in wooden panels. Holmes found the panels had dried unevenly after transport. A cobbler asked about unusual creasing in new boots. Holmes traced the issue to leather stored too close to a heat source. A potter experienced inconsistent glazing. Holmes discovered that air currents near the kiln caused temperature fluctuations. One especially detailed case emerged from a photography studio experiencing strange, faint lines on developed prints. Holmes examined the negatives, studied the developing chemicals, and inspected the darkroom. He found that a thin strand from a cloth curtain occasionally brushed against the drying negatives. The line patterns matched the curtain's fibre. Adjusting the curtain eliminated the interference. The photographer offered Holmes a compact magnifying loupe designed for examining negatives, which Holmes adopted immediately. A different inquiry arose from a seamstress whose sewing machine repeatedly jammed. Holmes disassembled the machine carefully and found that a small screw had loosened, misaligning the shuttle hook. Tightening the screw resolved the issue. The seamstress expressed gratitude and offered Holmes a spool of fine silk thread. Holmes accepted it, recognizing its value in measuring delicate objects. During these months, Holmes encountered a case involving a struggling workshop where workers reported that tools disappeared intermittently. Holmes inspected the workshop carefully. He discovered that certain metal tools slid behind a partition wall through a narrow gap created by vibrations from machinery. Retrieving the missing tools quieted the concerns. Holmes also helped a stationer whose envelopes showed faint impressions from unseen writing. Holmes examined the impressions under magnification and traced them to pressure from stacked boxes during transport. Adjusting the stacking method prevented further damage. Watson observed Holmes handling these cases with consistent calmness. He noted how Holmes used his tools methodically testing surfaces, checking angles, measuring distances, and collecting samples. Holmes did not dramatize his work. He approached each task with the same steady attention. One morning, Watson found forks arranged on the windowsill, each tagged with a small slip noting the hour it had been placed there. Watson said nothing, as he understood the purpose involved temperature studies. Holmes removed the forks later that day and recorded the results neatly in a notebook. One of Holmes's more involved early cases concerned a jeweller who believed someone tampered with his scale. Holmes inspected the scale's balance arms, weights, and fulcrum. He discovered that a faint layer of dust collected from a nearby polishing wheel had entered the apparatus, altering the balance subtly. Cleaning the mechanism restored accuracy. Holmes received a finely crafted balance weight as a gift. Another case involved a tailor whose shears dulled unusually fast. Holmes inspected the cutting table and noticed minute particles of grit on its surface, likely brought in from cobblestones outside. The tailor cleaned the table regularly afterward, and the problem disappeared. Holmes also visited a publishing office troubled by repeated ink blotches on stationery. He traced the problem to a leak in the roof that allowed moisture to enter on rainy nights. Repairing the leak eliminated the blotches. One multi-day inquiry centered on a boarding house where residents reported unexplained sounds at night. Holmes examined the floorboards, walls, and attic, eventually discovering that loose metal rods in the heating system vibrated under certain temperatures. Adjusting the rods silenced the noise. The residents expressed relief. Holmes's cases extended even to transportation issues. A cab driver asked about vibrations in his vehicle. Holmes examined the wheels and traced the issue to uneven wear caused by frequent use of a particular route with rough paving. Altering the route minimized the vibrations. Another matter brought Holmes to a confectioner whose chocolates developed faint marks. Holmes identified the cause as condensation forming when chocolates cooled too quickly near an open window. Adjusting the cooling process prevented further markings. Holmes approached each new inquiry with the same discipline. Examine the environment, compare conditions, test materials, and present the simplest explanation consistent with the evidence. Watson occasionally assisted by holding instruments or writing notes. One particularly interesting case involved an office where several pens cracked in identical fashion. Holmes examined the pens and found they had been stored near a heating pipe that caused expansion in the barrels. Moving the pens resolved the issue. Holmes also helped a watchmaker whose tools rusted quickly. Holmes traced the problem to moisture from a recently installed steam pipe. Once insulated, the rusting stopped. A warehouse manager sought Holmes's help after crates shifted unexpectedly. Holmes found the shift occurred due to uneven stacking on sloped flooring. Reorganizing the crates prevented further incidents. Holmes's early cases demonstrated the range of problems Londoners encountered in everyday life. He addressed each with steadiness, treating every object and surface with close attention. His approach required no guesswork, only careful observation and logical arrangement of facts. Throughout this period, Holmes kept expanding his catalogue of samples, notes, diagrams, and case references, but he continued to work with the same calmness. never altering his tone regardless of whether the case involved a factory, a shop, or a private home. London offered countless puzzles, and Holmes addressed them one after another, letting each inquiry add new material to his developing craft. The rise to fame. Requests for Sherlock Holmes's assistance expanded beyond the steady stream of tradespeople, clerks, and small business owners. London's network of professionals carried news quickly, and Holmes's clear explanations earned him growing recognition among individuals who preferred practical solutions without unnecessary procedures. His cases multiplied across districts, not through publicity but through matter-of-fact recommendations passed along from one person to another. The name Holmes began appearing in conversations about unusual problems, always spoken with the expectation of accuracy, rather than spectacle. One of the earliest signs of this wider recognition came through a barrister from Lincoln's Inn. He arrived at Baker Street with documents showing irregular indentations on several legal briefs. The barrister worried the indentations indicated unauthorized copying. Holmes examined the papers under angled lamplight and determined the marks resulted from a heavy brass paperweight repeatedly dropped on the desk by an impatient clerk. The paperweight's uneven surface produced faint impressions, identical across multiple documents. The explanation solved the matter cleanly. The barrister mentioned Holmes to colleagues, and soon legal offices began consulting him for handwriting inconsistencies, document impressions, and ink variations. A printing administrator from Fleet Street sought Holmes's help with an unusual issue. Newspaper bundles repeatedly arrived with faint smears across the headlines. Holmes studied the smears closely and discovered they originated from freshly painted railings near a delivery entrance. Delivery workers brushed bundles against the wet paint without noticing. Once the administrator repainted the railings with faster drying material, the smears ceased. The printing office appreciated Holmes's efficiency and shared his name with editors who occasionally faced unexplained production problems. Holmes also assisted a watch distributor, troubled by inconsistent performance in a new line of pocket watches. The distributor suspected manufacturing flaws. Holmes examined several watches and observed faint scratches inside the cases, caused by abrasive cloths used during polishing. The distributor replaced the cloths, and performance stabilized. Word spread among merchants that Holmes could identify inconsistencies even in precision instruments. A museum conservator requested his assistance next. Certain artifacts exhibited subtle discoloration along one side, raising concerns about improper handling. Holmes inspected the items and found that the discoloration matched patterns from a cleaning solution used sparingly near the exhibit cabinets. The solution evaporated unevenly during colder months, causing a residue to form. Adjusting the cleaning schedule resolved the problem. The conservator, impressed, recommended Holmes to other cultural institutions dealing with environmental issues affecting collections. As cases grew in frequency and complexity, Holmes refined his working methods. He stored samples in labelled containers, arranged by material type and district. He created charts comparing wear on different types of flooring. He maintained diagrams showing structural shifts in buildings due to temperature changes. Watson observed these changes with steady interest, helping occasionally by copying diagrams into cleaner formats. One of Holmes's more noted early cases came from a banker concerned about irregularities in coin weights. Holmes examined the coins with a sensitive scale and found minute differences caused by accumulated dust from canvas bags used for transport. The banker adopted new bags, solving the issue. The clarity of Holmes's explanation circulated through financial circles, earning him further inquiries. A case from a railway office followed. Freight logs displayed discrepancies in arrival times, prompting suspicion of deliberate alteration. Holmes examined the logs and found inconsistencies in ink shading. The discrepancies resulted not from fraud, but from a faulty ink batch reacting poorly to damp air near the station office. Once replaced, records stabilized. The station supervisor referred Holmes to colleagues managing other logistical concerns. Holmes's work expanded into engineering circles through a case involving a waterworks facility. Engineers noticed inconsistent pressure readings, threatening scheduled distribution. Holmes inspected the equipment and traced the issue to a build-up of mineral residue inside a gauge tube. Cleaning restored accuracy. The engineers documented his findings, spreading his reputation among technical workers. A particularly detailed case arrived from a tailor in Mayfair. Expensive garments displayed faint impressions along seams that no worker admitted causing. Holmes examined the garments and discovered the impressions matched the pattern of a wooden measuring board stored carelessly. When tailors leaned garments against the board during fittings, the wood left imprints. Adjusting storage practices resolved the issue. The tailor recommended Holmes to customers involved in broader manufacturing industries. Holmes's cases also extended into households of higher social standing. A gentleman in Belgravia noticed faint scratches on the surface of a polished desk. Holmes compared the scratches to several objects in the room and found they matched the brass buttons on the gentleman's coat. The gentleman accepted the explanation and adopted a felt cover for the desk. A lady reported irregular fading on drapery. Holmes traced it to sunlight refracted through a glass ornament on the windowsill. Removing the ornament prevented further fading. Word of Holmes's precision reached a hospital administrator who faced recurring misplacement of surgical instruments. Holmes observed the surgical rooms, examined storage drawers, and found that rolling carts shifted slightly due to uneven flooring, causing instruments to slide into recesses. Adjusting the carts resolved the problem. The administrator contacted other medical professionals who later sought Holmes's assistance with equipment issues. One case that circulated widely among London's professional groups involved a lithography shop troubled by persistent blotching. Holmes inspected the stones, inks, and presses. He discovered that the blotching occurred only when certain workers were present. Observing them quietly, he noticed one worker used a cloth treated with an oil inconsistent with lithographic ink. The oil interfered with the printing surface. Replacing the cloth solved the problem. The lithography shop credited Holmes's observation in their internal reports, leading other shops to consult him for production inconsistencies. Holmes also addressed an inquiry from a legal office investigating faint impressions on sealed documents. He found that recently upgraded lighting created minor shifts in wax temperature. Cooling the room before sealing documents resolved the issue. The legal staff recommended Holmes to colleagues handling delicate paperwork. A more unusual case came from a telegraph operator who noticed irregular clicks in the equipment. The operator feared tampering. Holmes inspected the machine and traced the irregular clicks to a slightly misaligned metal arm that vibrated under specific atmospheric conditions. A minor adjustment stabilized the machine. Telegraph supervisors shared news of Holmes's accuracy within their network. Holmes's reputation continued to grow through cases that demanded close observation rather than confrontation. He solved a problem involving cracked porcelain in a ceramics warehouse by identifying uneven drying. He addressed repeated spoilage in a grocer's storage room by discovering moisture trapped behind a newly installed wall panel. He examined leather goods for a saddler and traced irregular stretching to humidity fluctuations in the workshop. His work reached larger industrial establishments as well. A factory producing metal fittings sought Holmes's assistance when finished pieces showed inconsistent surface patterns. Holmes examined the production line and discovered that cooling bays exposed materials to drafts through an unsealed window. Sealing the window ensured uniform cooling. Factory managers acknowledged Holmes's contribution, leading others in manufacturing to seek his advice. Holmes also encountered cases involving public spaces. A park caretaker reported repeated damage to fencing. Holmes examined the break patterns and identified the cause as animals rubbing against weakened posts. Reinforcing the posts prevented further damage. A public hall experienced repeated irregularities in seating placement. Holmes traced the shifts to cleaning staff, moving chairs unevenly during late-night maintenance. Adjusting procedures resolved the matter. Holmes took on a case involving misaligned stonework in a building under construction. He measured the alignment carefully and identified an inconsistency in the mason's plumb tool. Replacing the tool corrected the issue. The contractors credited Holmes quietly in their reports. His work reached shipping offices through a case involving crate damage. Holmes examined the crates and found identical impact marks consistent with a loading hook used by only one crew. After retraining the crew, the damage ceased. The shipping office shared his findings with other companies. Holmes's reputation grew further when he assisted a clockmaker who faced irregular timing in a tower clock. Holmes climbed the tower, inspected the gears, and found dust collected near a pivot point. Cleaning the mechanism restored accuracy. The clockmaker spoke highly of his methodical approach, spreading word among mechanical trades. Holmes also took on a case involving recurring mould in a storage cellar. He traced the mould to moisture entering through a damaged exterior vent. Repairing the vent prevented further growth. The building manager recommended Holmes to other property owners. His work expanded into academic circles as well. A university laboratory sought help with inconsistent readings in chemical experiments. Holmes found that a recently installed window created drafts that affected flame stability in burners. Adjusting the window's position stabilized readings. The laboratory credited Holmes in their internal notes. One of the most widely discussed early cases involved a banker who faced discrepancies in ledger entries. Holmes examined the ledgers and found the discrepancies resulted from a clerk who unintentionally shifted between ink bottles with slightly different compositions. The differences altered the appearance of entries. Standardizing ink usage resolved the issue. The banker mentioned Holmes's work during a professional meeting, prompting inquiries from other financial institutions. Holmes's work continued at steady pace. A shoemaker consulted him about recurring damage to leather goods. Holmes traced the problem to residue on a workbench. A mill operator sought help identifying the cause of vibrations in a loom. Holmes found a flawed pulley. A magistrate asked Holmes to examine irregular marks on official documents. Holmes discovered the marks came from a damaged stamp pad. Through these varied inquiries, Holmes's name became attached to reliability. He acquired no public fame yet, but professionals across London regarded him as a dependable figure who explained puzzling issues clearly. Watson once returned home to find mirrors placed at different angles around the sitting room. Holmes explained he was testing how reflections distorted object outlines from different distances. Watson stepped carefully around the mirrors and resumed his reading. Holmes's inquiries persisted. A cabinet maker asked about warped drawers. Holmes traced the issue to a misplaced heat source. A textile dyer noticed inconsistent colouring. Holmes found the cause in varying water temperature. An apothecary sought help with faint residue appearing on bottles. Holmes traced it to evaporating spirits. Holmes's steady accumulation of solved cases led more Londoners to his door. His methods remained unchanged. Examine the environment, inspect materials, compare patterns, measure precisely, and present findings without unnecessary detail. By this stage, Holmes received inquiries from nearly every district of the city. None of these cases involved criminal investigations in the dramatic sense. They represented the daily technical challenges Londoners encountered. Holmes addressed each with unvarying attention, letting the evidence guide his steps from one explanation to the next. Clients began referring to him as someone with a talent for clarifying difficult things. His name circulated more frequently among professionals. Each case, no matter how small, added to a growing network of individuals who knew Holmes as the man who could identify causes others overlooked. His rise to fame began not through stories of chase or danger, but through the steady accumulation of precise, practical work carried out with unbroken calm. The great struggle, patterns involving Moriarty's influence continued appearing in Holmes's work, not as dramatic revelations but as steady accumulations of precise details. Individual cases still reached Baker Street in the usual fashion: letters, messengers, and clients arriving with straightforward concerns, but many of these matters bore structural signs, linking them to the same quiet network Holmes had documented. The cases remained grounded in ordinary life: altered reports, redirected shipments, manipulated figures, and disrupted systems. Yet the consistency of technique grew clearer. None of the clients suspected a larger framework. Each saw only the isolated problem before them. Holmes examined every case with the same calm focus. placing each new entry into his expanding map of connected patterns. One inquiry during this period came from a commercial insurer troubled by discrepancies in property assessments. Certain buildings listed measurements that did not match official records. Holmes visited several properties and compared the written measurements with the physical conditions. The discrepancies were small fractions of an inch, yet too consistent to result from careless work. Holmes traced the issue to a surveyor who unknowingly relied on a measuring rod subtly altered at its ends. The adjustment was nearly imperceptible, sanded so finely that a casual observer would find nothing wrong. The surveyor admitted he had purchased the tool second-hand from an intermediary whose name Holmes recognized from earlier cases connected to Moriarty's circles. Holmes recorded this link without assigning motive. Another matter involved a shipping company whose cargo records displayed anomalous routing instructions. The instructions appeared legitimate at first glance, but the cargo ended up consistently delayed or redirected. Holmes studied the documents and found the routing codes followed a recognizable pattern resembling the mathematical sequences used in earlier cases. He visited the warehouse, inspected the crates, and observed the workers' routine. The adjustments to routing labels matched no handwriting of the workers, but did match the structural forms Holmes found in Moriarty-associated documents. He explained only the mechanical cause to the shipping manager and added the handwriting analysis to his private notes. A chemical supplier sought Holmes's help identifying why shipments arrived with altered concentration labels. Holmes examined the labels and discovered faint indentations under the ink. The indentations indicated that someone had overwritten the labels after the initial writing dried. The indentations' angles corresponded exactly to a series of alterations in a scientific report Holmes had reviewed weeks earlier. The scientist who authored that report occasionally collaborated with mathematicians in Moriarty's academic circles. Holmes placed the evidence in his expanding diagram. Holmes also encountered a case involving architectural plans. An architect discovered that certain structural calculations in his blueprints had been altered by someone with clear engineering understanding. The changes were subtle, but potentially dangerous. Holmes compared the altered figures with original drafts and found that the new calculations introduced unnecessary complexity. He traced the alterations to a clerk in a partnering firm whose mathematical training closely resembled the style found in Moriarty's published work. Holmes recommended a review of all calculations but made no public conclusion about intent. During this period, Watson observed Holmes's growing collection of linked cases. Holmes stored them in a series of labelled folders that filled an entire shelf. He organised them by category: numeric alterations, document diversions, routing interference, survey modifications, and technical adjustments. Watson occasionally asked whether these cases formed part of a larger concern. Holmes replied only with factual descriptions of the similarities: handwriting pressure, numerical symmetry, geometric patterning, and mathematical handwriting traits. He avoided speculation. More cases appeared. A bank reported irregularities in account ledgers that required expert examination. Holmes spent several days reviewing records, comparing ink densities, and studying ledger alignment. He found that the adjustments followed a cycle, occurring at regular intervals. The cycle matched the sequence used to alter maps in a previous case traced to a mathematician who studied under Moriarty. Holmes presented his findings to the bank in terms of mechanical cause and filed the connection privately. A publisher approached Holmes regarding strange spacing in typeset documents. Certain lines shifted slightly, disrupting alignment. Holmes examined the printing equipment and discovered someone adjusted the spacing mechanism by fractions too small for typical workers to notice. The adjustment required knowledge of tension dynamics and the patience to alter the mechanism undetected. Holmes later identified that the shop had recently hired an employee who once worked in an academic environment associated with Moriarty. The publisher replaced the part, resolving the issue. Another case involved street lamp failures in a small London district. The failures appeared random until Holmes examined the wiring diagrams. He found that the outages followed a mathematical progression rather than electrical instability. Someone with technical skill had altered part of the circuit to reroute power. The lineman responsible for recent maintenance had previously been employed in a firm tied to Moriarty's network. Holmes documented the connection. Watson noted that Holmes's notes on Moriarty grew in quantity. He wrote none of them dramatically. His entries contained only observations. Pressure mark consistent with specimen C. Numeric correction aligns with sequence pattern. Ink distribution identical to previous altered ledger, and other simple notations. Holmes never labelled Moriarty as criminal. He treated the emerging network as a system requiring mapping. A particularly intricate case involved a financial firm whose safe showed signs of entry without force. Holmes inspected the safe's mechanics and found no tampering with the lock. Instead, he discovered that the tumbler mechanism misaligned by precisely calculated increments, allowing access with minimal manipulation. The misalignment required mathematical precision well beyond that of ordinary mechanics. Holmes traced the adjustment to a technician employed briefly by the firm. The technician's academic advisor, as Holmes learned through public records, had been Moriarty. Holmes placed the case in his files and continued working on ordinary matters alongside these patterned alterations. Another inquiry involved altered shipping manifests that arrived with incorrect weights. Holmes compared the manifests and identified that the alterations matched a sequence found earlier in an engineering report. A clerk at the shipping office shared educational ties with Moriarty's mathematical department. Holmes added the connection. A surveying company sought Holmes's help after maps showed anomalies in triangulation points. Holmes examined the maps, instruments, and calculations. The inaccuracies were not random. They formed a geometric progression consistent with earlier cases. The surveyor responsible had worked under Moriarty during academic training. Holmes simply mapped the connection and moved on. During these months, Holmes's map of linked cases grew steadily. He created diagrams across large sheets of paper, noting each instance of precise interference. Watson observed Holmes working quietly at the table, measuring angles in documents, identifying handwriting styles, and connecting cases by reference number rather than speculation. The resulting network contained dozens of related entries. One of the most significant cases in this period reached Holmes through a high-ranking official who wished to remain unnamed. The official suspected that confidential documents were being altered subtly across multiple divisions. Holmes examined samples from each division and found that the alterations followed a single structural method. Although different hands executed the changes, all displayed mathematical symmetry characteristic of Moriarty's academic work. Holmes presented his findings factually, noting only the method, not the motive. As Holmes's understanding of the pattern grew, so did the complexity of cases entering his care. A shipping route became disrupted due to a series of minor navigational adjustments that, when combined, diverted cargo unnecessarily. Holmes traced the adjustments to a navigator who corresponded with Moriarty's department. A government ledger displayed inconsistent arithmetic corrections. Holmes found the corrections aligned with sequences used in Moriarty's research. A warehouse experienced unexplained inventory shifts that mirrored patterns Holmes recognized from coded telegraph transmissions. Holmes added each entry with calm precision. As Holmes's casework deepened, a new type of inquiry emerged, one involving physical precision rather than clerical or mathematical adjustments. A bridge maintenance crew reported unusual stress lines on support beams. Holmes inspected the structure and identified markings indicating deliberate weakening at specific points. The markings matched patterns in earlier engineering interference cases. The foreman revealed that a consultant hired months earlier had previously studied under Moriarty. A shipping barge experienced repeated disruptions in loading schedules due to altered tugboat assignments. Holmes reviewed the assignment logs and found coded sequences identical to those used in telegraph rerouting. A clerk in the Port Authority had attended lectures delivered by Moriarty. Holmes noted the connection. Multiple cases accumulated, funding requests diverted by sequence-based clerical edits, train schedules altered with mathematical precision. architectural diagrams modified by individuals with advanced geometric skill. Holmes made diagrams connecting each person to academic or professional circles around Moriarty. Some links were direct, others formed through secondary associations. During this period, a particularly detailed case arrived involving an apparent break-in at a government archive. No locks were damaged, and nothing appeared stolen, yet certain files were shifted slightly. Holmes examined the files and found that someone had rearranged them to alter the chronological order. The alteration followed the same mathematical pattern Holmes had documented many times before. He traced the action to a recently hired archivist with past employment in a department connected to Moriarty's field of study. Holmes added this to the growing structure. The cases continued. A transportation office reported mismatched times on freight schedules. Holmes traced this to a clerk trained in mathematical modelling. A museum found that catalogue numbers were altered in a pattern that matched sequences in Moriarty's published work. A private office noted that charts were corrected in handwriting consistent with a student of Moriarty. Holmes recorded the evidence without emotion. The network of related cases expanded until Holmes could no longer ignore the density of connections. Without using dramatic language, he identified the system as one guided by Moriarty's influence directly or indirectly. Still, Holmes conducted his daily work in the same manner. Ordinary inquiries involving damaged fabric, worn hinges, or misaligned shelves continued alongside these deeper investigations. Holmes never shifted his tone. The turning point in this period arrived when Holmes received a request from Scotland Yard to examine irregularities in freight shipments involving multiple companies. The Yard suspected an organised effort to divert goods. Holmes studied the records and found that the diversions followed a complex sequence requiring advanced mathematical design. The design matched Moriarty's academic notation precisely. This was the first official case in which Holmes explicitly reported that the structural evidence suggested involvement beyond typical criminal behaviour. Shortly after, Holmes began receiving anonymous notes, brief instructions or corrections, written with exceptional mathematical clarity. The handwriting displayed traits Holmes recognised from earlier cases. The notes contained no threat, no emotion. They simply presented alternate interpretations of Holmes's work, as though another mind were mapping the same structures. Holmes placed the notes in a folder marked with a simple letter, M. Their exchanges were not conversations nor confrontations. They were parallel analyses, moving through the same patterns. Holmes recognised that someone observed the city with equal precision. The evidence suggested that Moriarty operated not as an isolated figure, but as the intellectual centre of a coordinated network. Holmes responded not with declarations but with increased attention to detail. At this stage, Scotland Yard asked Holmes to consult more frequently. Inspectors presented cases involving unusual escapes, coded documents, and missing materials. Holmes recognised patterns linking each to Moriarty's network. The Yard asked for names. Holmes provided only the structural evidence. This accumulation led to one of Holmes's most extensive analyses, a citywide map of interference points, marked with small pins and thin strings, tracing the mathematical connections among them. Watson observed the map taking shape, expanding across an entire wall. The patterns converged at a single point, an academic address associated with Moriarty. Holmes did not announce conclusions. He simply prepared for the next case. The case arrived soon afterward, an international matter involving documents transported across borders. The transport route required Holmes to analyse coded patterns that appeared in multiple countries. The structure matched Moriarty's method exactly. Holmes traced the interference across train lines, ports and couriers until it converged again on Moriarty's network. At last, Holmes and Scotland Yard coordinated an effort to track the flow of information to its source. This effort brought Holmes face to face with the logistics of Moriarty's operations, couriers, clerks, engineers, and mathematicians whose combined precision supported a larger structure. Holmes followed the evidence to its final point of intersection, the path leading to the event later known as the confrontation at Reichenbach Falls. No narration of emotion, no forecast, no dramatization. Only the next step in a sequence of evidence. Holmes prepared to follow the trail precisely as it appeared. Reichenbach. Holmes followed the sequence of evidence with the same steadiness he applied to every prior case. The trail that began with altered ledgers, misdirected shipments, and mathematically consistent adjustments now extended beyond London's familiar boundaries. Requests from Scotland Yard grew more frequent, each involving disruptions traced through multiple levels of administration. Every case featured the disciplined precision Holmes had long associated with Moriarty's network. Though the inquiries varied clerical inconsistencies, mechanical failures, coded transmissions, the pattern behind them maintained the same structure. Holmes treated each one as another entry in a growing sequence. The transition from city-bound investigations to work involving international routes occurred quietly. A case emerged concerning documents transported between London and the continent. The papers arrived altered in ways that did not match the handwriting of any courier. Holmes examined the ink flow and found that the alterations were done in motion, suggesting the writer possessed unusual steadiness even while travelling. The mathematical balance of the script matched earlier specimens linked to Moriarty's circles. Holmes catalogued the case and traced the alterations across several transfer stations. Another inquiry came through diplomatic channels. A set of engineering plans had been copied with extreme accuracy, yet contained subtle differences that introduced structural miscalculations. Holmes compared the plans and found geometrical deviations following a pattern sequence. The deviations were consistent with the mathematical handwriting of someone trained in Moriarty's discipline. Holmes prepared a report for the officials, listing only the mechanical explanation behind the inconsistency. Holmes also encountered coded messages appearing in telegraph offices along railway lines. These codes matched sequences from earlier London cases, though now distributed across multiple countries. Holmes analysed the transmissions, recognizing that the pattern represented not a single code, but a shifting system that adapted depending on geographic location. This required coordination beyond local networks. Holmes mapped the transmissions onto a larger chart, creating a visual demonstration of the distribution pattern. The converging lines formed a broader structure that indicated strategic coordination rather than isolated incidents. A turning point in the investigation came when Scotland Yard requested Holmes's help on a matter involving a fugitive whose escape patterns matched the mathematical cycles found earlier. The Yard suspected a larger organisational system allowed the fugitive to move between locations undetected. Holmes studied the records, carriage timetables, and border crossings, identifying precise intervals at which the individual changed routes. These intervals matched patterns Holmes had documented in Moriarty-related cases. Holmes produced a report showing the mechanical pattern, offering no theoretical interpretation beyond the observable facts. Requests continued at a steady pace. Misrouted shipments whose altered labels followed coded sequences. Financial transactions adjusted with mathematical symmetry. Mechanical disruptions in factories timed according to predictable intervals. Holmes added each to his diagrams, widening the structure until it filled nearly an entire wall. During this period, Holmes received occasional notes written in the same measured hand that had appeared earlier, brief, concise statements correcting small assumptions or offering alternative interpretations. The notes bore no threat and lacked emotional tone. They simply presented parallel analysis. Holmes placed them in the folder marked M, adding page numbers and cross-references as the sequence expanded. Watson observed Holmes's work with quiet attention. The notes from Moriarty revealed something different from typical criminal correspondence. They displayed no flourish or menace, only precise reasoning. Holmes responded by refining his diagrams, noting where Moriarty's adjustments aligned with or diverged from his own. The inquiry that led Holmes out of London began with a request from an official managing transportation security along international routes. Several incidents involving missing documents and altered cargo lists followed the same structural patterns recorded in earlier cases. Holmes reviewed the documents, studied the ink samples, and examined the transportation logs. He found that the alterations followed a mathematical cycle culminating in a single convergence point extending beyond England's borders. The path led south through multiple cities and eventually into Switzerland. This convergence prompted Scotland Yard to coordinate with Holmes on a broader investigation. The Yard sought to understand the structure behind the coordinated disruptions. Holmes agreed to accompany the inquiry, treating the journey as an extension of the evidence trail. Watson prepared to join him as well, though Holmes suggested Watson travel separately for practical reasons related to health and timing. Holmes travelled with minimal luggage, notebooks, lenses, and diagrams. He recorded observations at each station, noting where coded patterns reappeared. The journey revealed further signs of Moriarty's network railway adjustments timed with mathematical accuracy, document transfers executed with identical pressure patterns, and coded messages transmitted at intervals matching previous cases. As Holmes approached Switzerland, the evidence grew increasingly concentrated. He found multiple instances of alterations made with disciplined hand numbers written with consistent slant, diagrams corrected with precise calculation, and documents rearranged in patterns matching Moriarty's academic work. Holmes recorded these quietly, marking each entry as another step in the sequence. Scotland Yard's communication during this period suggested they believed Moriarty planned further coordinated adjustments to international systems, financial, administrative, and logistical. Yet the evidence remained purely structural. Holmes mapped each connection as it appeared without interpreting motive or intent. Upon reaching Switzerland, Holmes continued tracing the sequence. The trail led toward a remote region near Meiringen. Here, Holmes identified more coded adjustments, altered reports from courier stations, misdirected correspondence, and unnatural timing of shipments. The consistency matched his earlier findings. Holmes and Watson reunited in Meiringen. Watson observed Holmes's steady focus, no anticipation, no dramatic tension, only concentrated attention to the evidence before him. They travelled by foot toward the mountains, continuing to follow the sequence through villages and stations. Along the path, Holmes noted small signs of intentional arrangement. Fresh footprints appeared in patterns matching earlier mathematical sequences. Stones along the trail shifted slightly, indicating planned direction changes. None of this suggested haste. Instead, the evidence pointed to someone maintaining methodical control even in remote terrain. Their route eventually brought them to the Reichenbach Falls. The falls produced a constant surge of water, sending mist into the surrounding rocks. Holmes examined the terrain, the narrow ledge, the water's impact, and the footpaths leading to and from the falls. He noted small marks on a rock where someone had stood for a period of time, pressure indentations along the ledge consistent with careful movement, and fragments of chalk identical to those used in earlier coded markings. Holmes continued forward, following the evidence until the path narrowed significantly. Watson recalled that Holmes walked with his usual precision, each step measured, each observation recorded mentally. A messenger approached Watson soon afterward, delivering a note requesting his assistance at a local inn. Watson complied, though with hesitation. Upon returning to the falls, Watson found the ledge empty. Holmes was nowhere visible. The ground showed scuffle marks and shattered stone at the edge. The evidence indicated that two individuals had stood together and then moved toward the precipice. Holmes's footprints appeared up to the edge, positioned with deliberate steadiness. Another set of footprints, heavier and spaced differently, followed his. Beyond that point, the markings vanished where the stone broke under pressure. Watson examined the remaining evidence with the clarity Holmes had taught him. The direction of the footprints, the pressure marks along the ledge, the broken stone, the absence of return tracks. Holmes's investigation ended at the point where the evidence ceased to continue. The falls concealed the final details, leaving only the structural traces of the struggle. Watson returned to Baker Street carrying Holmes's notebooks, diagrams and samples. Scotland Yard later confirmed that Moriarty had vanished at the same time, following the same trail of evidence, and never reappeared. Holmes's final recorded entry concerned a coded sequence that ended at Reichenbach. The sequence had reached completion, returned to Baker Street. Holmes's reappearance in London did not create headlines or stir public excitement. It passed quietly through the professional circles that had once depended on him, a matter discussed in low tones by clerks, merchants, and the occasional inspector who remembered how efficiently Holmes handled matters that resisted ordinary explanation. Those who heard of his return approached Baker Street cautiously at first, uncertain whether he would resume work or prefer solitude. But Holmes accepted inquiries with the same calm steadiness he showed before Reichenbach, and the rhythm of visits gradually returned. The sitting room itself regained the gentle activity that had once defined it. Holmes moved through the space with familiar precision, adjusting the lamp for optimal lighting, sorting his instruments by category, and inspecting the shelves of samples that Watson had preserved. Dust had not settled heavily during Holmes's absence. Watson's care saw to that, but Holmes still conducted a thorough review of each container, noting humidity levels, integrity of seals, and the clarity of labels. He replaced a few with updated handwriting, aligning the script with the larger system he had maintained for years. The city, meanwhile, continued its own progress. New tram lines extended through certain districts, altering the patterns of traffic and bringing fresh soot to windowsills Holmes had examined before. Gas lamps were replaced in some areas with brighter designs that cast different shadows along evening streets. Holmes observed these changes during walks with Watson. He marked the difference in lamp placement, measured the angle of shadows with discreet glances, and studied how recently installed road surfaces influenced wheel impressions. Watson accompanied him patiently, noting how Holmes adapted to updated conditions the same way he had adapted to foreign environments during his travels after Reichenbach. One of Holmes's first inquiries after his return involved a jeweller from Marylebone. The jeweller arrived with a collection of small watch components, gears, screws, and springs that displayed faint irregularities. He suspected a manufacturing error. Holmes examined the components under a lens, comparing their surfaces with samples from his reference collection. He discovered that the irregularities came from a polishing cloth used at too high a temperature during finishing. The cloth had absorbed heat unevenly, causing slight deformation in the softer metals. Holmes demonstrated the issue by applying controlled pressure to one of the gears, producing a similar pattern. The jeweller thanked him and left with clear instructions for correcting the process. Another inquiry reached Holmes from a tailor whose mannequins suffered unexpected warping. The tailor believed humidity might be the cause. Holmes inspected the mannequins, noting the direction of the warping and the distribution of pressure marks along the wooden bases. The mannequins had been placed near a newly installed stove, whose heat caused expansion on one side. Holmes suggested relocating them, and the tailor implemented the adjustment immediately. A third case involved a solicitor dealing with irregular fading in a set of important documents. Holmes compared the documents and found the fading to be uniform, along edges exposed to light reflected from a nearby glass fixture. The solicitor had never considered the fixture responsible. Holmes recommended repositioning the documents or replacing the fixture with one less prone to strong reflection. Holmes addressed these inquiries with the same calm pacing that had always defined his work. Watson observed that Holmes occasionally paused during his examinations to adjust his tools or measure angles precisely. None of these movements suggested urgency. Holmes worked as though time presented itself in consistent intervals, each suited to a different aspect of observation. More cases arrived as word of Holmes's return reached wider circles. A factory owner sought his help after noticing inconsistent pressure readings in a steam-powered machine. Holmes visited the factory, examined the machinery, and discovered that one of the gauges contained a small hairline crack near its base. The crack distorted readings by tiny increments, unnoticed by factory workers. Holmes instructed the owner to replace the gauge, preventing further confusion. A bookseller approached him with concerns about the subtle shifting of books on a display shelf. Holmes examined the shelf and detected faint vibrations caused by foot traffic from a newly opened shop next door. The frequency of movement matched the pattern of the vibrations. He suggested reinforcing the shelf, and the problem ceased. A clerk from a legal office brought Holmes lists of case files that frequently went missing only to reappear days later in unusual locations. Holmes inspected the office and found that the files were stored near a door that employees closed too forcefully. The resulting airflow caused loose papers to slide into gaps between cabinets. Holmes demonstrated this by opening the door under controlled conditions, reproducing the missing file's path precisely. The office adjusted their storage practices accordingly. Holmes continued receiving cases involving mechanical inconsistencies, environmental effects, and subtle human habits. A potter's kiln produced inconsistent glazing because of unnoticed drafts from a damaged wall. A cobbler's leather cracked prematurely due to a worker's pressure technique. A schoolteacher's chalk broke frequently because of improper drying after delivery. Holmes addressed each with steady examination and clear explanation. One of the more intricate cases during this era came from a merchant who imported fine textiles. The merchant noticed slight discoloration in bolts of fabric after storage. Holmes examined the bolts and found the discoloration formed along folds exposed to air currents from a ventilation grate. The merchant had recently renovated his storeroom, shifting airflow patterns in the process. Holmes suggested rearranging the shelves to protect delicate materials, and the merchant followed the recommendation. Holmes resumed his study of tobacco ash with renewed interest. He updated his catalogue to include several new varieties collected during his travels. Watson watched as Holmes arranged small glass tubes in careful rows, labelling each with district, blend, and identifying features. Holmes occasionally shook a sample lightly to observe how the ash settled. Watson made no comment, having long grown accustomed to the process. Holmes continued to update his soil collection as well. He compared samples from before his absence with those recently collected in London. He noted the increased presence of residue from new road materials and added these observations to his reference charts. His return brought new systematization. He now tracked seasonal variations in soil composition across districts, anticipating future cases where such knowledge might prove useful. During these months, Holmes developed a renewed interest in testing subtle differences in sound. He tapped gently on metal trays, wooden shelves, and glass vials, noting the pitch and tone of each. Watson observed this calmly, stepping around Holmes when necessary. Holmes recorded the results with crisp handwriting, as though cataloguing a new category of evidence. Midway through this period, Scotland Yard resumed seeking Holmes's assistance. Inspector Gregson approached Holmes with a matter involving discrepancies in shipping seals along the river. Holmes accompanied Gregson to the dockside, examined the seals, and found that certain wax impressions had been applied with too much pressure. The impressions matched the work of a dock worker known for his forceful technique. Holmes identified the worker and explained the mechanical cause of the inconsistencies, enabling the yard to correct the issue without further difficulty. Another inquiry from the yard concerned unusual footprints discovered near a warehouse during a minor theft report. Holmes examined the prints and found they belonged not to a thief, but to a warehouse employee whose gait produced distinctive heel impressions. Holmes demonstrated the pattern by showing how weight distribution affected stride length. The yard resolved the case with minimal disruption. Holmes's methodical approach continued attracting cases from diverse fields. An engineer sought his help solving irregular vibrations in a bridge structure. Holmes inspected the bridge, studying the placement of beams and the distribution of weight during peak traffic hours. He identified a series of misaligned supports that created a resonance under certain conditions. Adjusting the supports resolved the vibration. A university professor requested Holmes's analysis of faint marks on manuscripts. Holmes discovered that the marks came from an overly sharp writing instrument used during transcription. The professor adjusted the instrument's pressure, preventing further issues. Holmes also assisted a household troubled by a repeating rattle in their library. He inspected the room, noting the arrangement of books, furniture, and window fixtures. He found that temperature fluctuations caused a metal latch to expand and contract, creating the rattle. A simple adjustment solved the problem. Throughout this sequence of cases, Watson observed Holmes's habits with growing familiarity. Holmes resumed pacing the sitting room during moments of concentration, measuring steps unconsciously. He occasionally paused to examine a piece of furniture or adjust the angle of a lamp. Watson recognized these movements as signs of Holmes's internal process, the same steady, thoughtful habits that defined his life before Reichenbach. Despite the return to routine, Holmes received occasional inquiries related to remnants of Moriarty's former network. These inquiries lacked the precision characteristic of Moriarty's earlier influence. Some involved minor alterations to documents, while others concerned inconsistencies in warehouse tallies. Holmes identified these as isolated attempts by individuals once connected to Moriarty, but no longer operating under coordinated structure. He addressed each case with factual explanation and made no reference to Moriarty himself. One such case involved a set of coded messages intercepted near a railway station. The messages contained patterns resembling earlier sequences but lacked the mathematical rigour Holmes had come to recognise. He analysed the messages and determined they were attempts to imitate a system without understanding its underlying structure. Scotland Yard treated them as minor disturbances. Holmes also encountered a case involving counterfeit labels on imported goods. The labels showed faint inconsistencies in ink texture. Holmes traced the issue to a small workshop operating independently, rather than to any coordinated effort. He explained the mechanical cause and allowed the yard to handle the rest. Gradually, the remnants of Moriarty's influence faded from Holmes's work. The network that once shaped numerous cases dissolved, leaving only small traces scattered among ordinary inquiries. During one quiet month, Holmes turned his attention to updating his monographs. He added new notes on fabric discoloration, refined his charts on wood expansion, and expanded his studies of handwriting pressure under different lighting conditions. Watson occasionally assisted by organising materials or returning borrowed items to institutions that had lent Holmes reference samples. Holmes began storing weights of different sizes in various corners of the sitting room to test floorboard sensitivity. Watson nearly tripped over one of these weights before Holmes adjusted their placement. Holmes apologised mildly and marked their positions in a notebook, ensuring they remained consistent for future experiments. Holmes's return also renewed correspondence with old acquaintances. Some wrote seeking advice on equipment, while others shared observations from their own professions. Holmes responded with measured detail, offering concise guidance without unnecessary elaboration. Baker Street's familiar rhythm returned fully in those weeks. Visitors knocked at predictable hours, newspapers arrived with regular commentary on civic changes, and Holmes worked with steady discipline, assembling facts as naturally as others took daily meals. London adjusted to Holmes's renewed presence, calling upon him for matters large and small. Cases arrived involving cracked porcelain, inconsistent ledger entries, structural irregularities, and environmental variations affecting manufacturing. Holmes addressed each with the clarity that had always defined him. There was no dramatic shift marking Holmes's return. Instead, life settled into a restored sequence, one that carried the continuity of past work while making room for new details, new observations, and new patterns that would later shape the next stage of Holmes's life. Holmes moved through it all with unbroken calm, public recognition. Holmes's quiet return to Baker Street eventually reached circles beyond the craftsmen, merchants, and officials who relied on his analysis. For years, his work had circulated almost invisibly through professional networks, passed along in matter-of-fact tones by people who valued clarity more than spectacle. But as the number of resolved inquiries accumulated, and as Holmes resumed accepting cases from a broader range of institutions, his name began migrating into public conversation. It happened slowly, without any announcement or event, the way a practical tool becomes widely known because it consistently works. Newspapers had mentioned him occasionally before Reichenbach, usually in small paragraphs describing assistance from a consulting expert. These early references produced little attention, but shortly after Holmes resumed work, a local paper published a piece describing the resolution of a complex clerical discrepancy at a major financial house. The article mentioned Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, identifying him as a figure whose precision uncovered an error that multiple auditors had overlooked. The wording was simple, without embellishment, yet it marked the first time a newspaper offered Holmes clear public recognition. Holmes read the article without comment. Watson, who read it over breakfast, noted the accuracy of the information. Holmes only remarked that the reporter had miscalculated one of the figures quoted in the article. Watson corrected the figure quietly, folded the paper, and placed it aside. Despite Holmes's indifference, public recognition increased. Another article appeared weeks later, this time in a journal devoted to industrial progress. It described a manufacturing inconsistency that Holmes had traced to a ventilation issue above a drying bay. The writer praised Holmes's methodical approach grounded in scientific observation, noting that his assistance saved the company considerable cost. The journal's audience consisted largely of engineers and factory owners, and many took interest in Holmes's habit of identifying causes through physical evidence alone. Soon after, a magazine focusing on legal affairs published a short editorial on the growing use of forensic techniques in document examination. The editorial referenced Holmes's work comparing handwriting pressure and ink distribution. Though it did not profile Holmes directly, the mention reinforced his reputation among lawyers and clerks who already knew of his reliability. Watson observed these developments with measured interest. He understood that Holmes's reputation did not arise from dramatic incidents but from repeated accuracy. People valued solutions that made their work easier, and Holmes provided those solutions consistently. As these stories circulated, individuals from outside Holmes's professional network began writing letters to Baker Street. Some asked for help with personal matters, a mislaid will, an unexplained stain on a garment, a discrepancy in household accounts. Holmes replied to each letter with factual clarity. In some cases, he directed them to local craftsmen or officials better suited to resolving the matter. Holmes accepted only inquiries that presented physical evidence suitable for observation. He avoided matters requiring speculation or emotional interpretation. This selectivity contributed to the perception that he dealt exclusively with complex problems, though in truth his cases remained a balanced mixture of simple and intricate tasks. One of the first significant public inquiries after his return involved a disturbance at a large department store. Customers reported receiving incorrect parcels, and the store's internal system showed no pattern to the misplacements. The management sought Holmes's assistance after reading newspaper accounts of his work. Holmes visited the store, studied the arrangement of conveyor belts and labelling stations, and identified the problem as a rhythmic misalignment in the labelling mechanism. The misalignment occurred every 57th parcel, caused by a loose cog whose worn notch produced a repeating cycle of error. Holmes advised repairing the mechanism, and the problem ceased. When the store published a statement thanking him, newspapers printed brief summaries of the case. These summaries led to further inquiries. A cultural institution invited Holmes to analyse subtle damage appearing on the edges of paintings in their collection. Holmes inspected the frames, humidity controls, and lighting arrangement. He discovered uneven temperature pulses from a poorly regulated heating system that caused the wood to expand and contract in unpredictable intervals. The institution corrected the issue, and a curator wrote publicly about Holmes's contribution. Academics took note. So did individuals in related professions. Holmes's popularity grew more steadily when Watson, at the encouragement of several colleagues, began publishing carefully written accounts of selected cases. These writings focused on Holmes's methods rather than dramatic events. Watson wrote in a steady, observational tone, describing how Holmes examined objects, measured distances, or compared notes. Watson did not embellish the cases, nor did he assign emotional narratives. He simply presented the process as he witnessed it. Readers responded positively to the clarity of Watson's accounts. They enjoyed seeing how ordinary evidence could produce understandable solutions. Some wrote letters asking whether Holmes used intuition. Watson consistently replied that Holmes relied on observation, not instinct. The public found reassurance in this practicality. A figure who uncovered truth through methodical reasoning appealed to workers in every profession. Watson's writings appeared in small journals at first, then in larger publications. Each story brought more awareness to Holmes's work. Baker Street began receiving letters from university students, amateur investigators, and tradespeople who admired Holmes's approach. Some even sent samples, soil, ash, fibres, hoping Holmes would examine them. Holmes handled these with polite efficiency, replying only when necessary. Public attention increased further when an educational journal requested Holmes's opinion on the use of scientific methods in everyday problem-solving. Holmes wrote a short response, emphasizing careful observation, systematic comparison, and the avoidance of speculation. The journal printed the letter, and teachers across London circulated it among students. Holmes's name became associated with the value of disciplined thinking. Despite this rising recognition, Holmes maintained his usual habits. He continued pacing the sitting room while thinking, testing objects for structural integrity, and organizing his notes by category. He began grouping similar cases by weight rather than subject. Watson noticed Holmes stacking folders in balanced columns, then measuring the stacks discreetly to ensure even distribution. Watson said nothing, but placed a spare ruler on the desk, which Holmes accepted silently. Holmes handled public attention with characteristic detachment. When newspapers requested interviews, he declined without irritation, stating that his work depended on accuracy rather than publicity. Some journalists respected this. Others attempted to interview him indirectly by contacting former clients. The resulting articles varied in precision. Some accurately described Holmes's methods. Others introduced speculation or dramatization Holmes did not appreciate. He ignored the inaccuracies and continued working. As Holmes's recognition grew, Scotland Yard approached him more frequently. Several cases featured irregularities the Yard could not explain. Holmes assisted when his schedule allowed, offering concise reports that inspectors valued for their clarity. His involvement in these cases eventually reached newspapers, often through brief mentions such as with assistance from Mr. Sherlock Holmes. These acknowledgements strengthened his public identity as a consulting expert. One case that attracted public interest involved a series of miscalculations in the construction of a railway extension. The errors appeared to threaten schedule delays. Engineers suspected sabotage. Holmes examined the calculations and discovered that the errors resulted from a newly hired assistant misinterpreting a structural formula. The assistant applied a continental notation unfamiliar to most British engineers. Holmes explained the discrepancy and provided a corrected formula. When the railway announced the resolution publicly, Holmes's contribution made its way into several newspapers. Another widely discussed case involved paintings at a gallery showing faint distortions that visitors speculated about. Holmes inspected the gallery and identified slight shifts in the lighting fixtures caused by vibrations from traffic outside. Once technicians stabilized the lights, the distortions vanished. A journalist present during the inspection wrote about Holmes's methodical evaluation, and the story spread through cultural magazines. Holmes's public recognition increased gradually, but steadily. He never encouraged fame or shaped a public persona. People admired him not for theatrics but for reliability. He did not cultivate mystery, he simply worked. In this period, Holmes also began receiving invitations from academic institutions, asking him to lecture on observation. He declined all such invitations, though he occasionally met privately with researchers who sought his insight into classification, measurement, and comparative analysis. These meetings strengthened his image among academics as a practitioner of applied reasoning rather than theorist. Holmes's popularity reached its height when a national newspaper printed a long article titled "The Consulting Detective of Baker Street." Watson did not write the article, but its phrasing suggested someone familiar with Holmes's methods. The piece described Holmes's work on several known cases and emphasized his reliance on scientific observation. Public response was immediate. People wrote letters praising Holmes as a model of disciplined thought. A few speculated about his personal habits, though Holmes ignored such conjecture. The increased attention caused a rise in visitors to Baker Street. Some brought genuine cases involving physical evidence. Others arrived with vague concerns unsuitable for Holmes's methods. Holmes handled these with quiet efficiency, sometimes redirecting individuals to appropriate professionals. Holmes did not alter his lifestyle despite recognition. He maintained the same working schedule, accepted cases at his discretion, and continued studying materials with the same steady patience. Watson observed that fame did not change Holmes's tone or habits. The sitting room remained a place of instruments, samples, diagrams, and quiet conversation. The only visible adjustment came when Holmes reorganized his ash collection to accommodate new blends sent by admirers. One day, a small group of students arrived at Baker Street, eager to meet the master of observation. Holmes welcomed them politely and demonstrated how he compared two handwriting samples. His demonstration was modest, lacking flourish. The students thanked him and departed, leaving a small box of chocolates that Holmes promptly gave to Watson. Through these interactions, Holmes's public identity settled into place not as a celebrity, but as a respected figure whose clarity offered stability in a rapidly changing city. London grew more complex each year, with new technologies, expanding industries, and shifting systems. Holmes provided a calm method for understanding these complexities. His recognition reached beyond London as well. Letters from abroad arrived, some from officials seeking advice on clerical inconsistencies, others from academics curious about Holmes's methods. Holmes replied selectively, choosing cases where evidence could be evaluated through written description. Watson observed with quiet satisfaction how Holmes's work influenced public thinking. People began emphasizing accuracy in their professions. Clerks double-checked numbers, craftsmen monitored environmental conditions, and merchants examined their stock more carefully. Holmes's influence extended through behavior rather than rhetoric. Despite this broader impact, Holmes remained unchanged. He continued identifying mechanical causes behind puzzling effects, cataloguing ash, studying soil, and observing the small rhythms of the city. Recognition became an external detail, separate from the steady internal process that guided his work. The public came to see Holmes as a figure of disciplined reasoning, a steady presence who navigated the complexities of modern life through observation, measurement, and patient consideration of facts. And Holmes, with characteristic calm, allowed the recognition to exist without shaping him. New cases. Holmes's public reputation created a gentle but steady stream of inquiries from individuals and institutions across London. These inquiries differed from those of earlier years. Previously, Holmes received cases primarily from those who had exhausted practical options. Clerks puzzled by irregular figures, craftsmen dealing with subtle mechanical failures, or merchants encountering problems in daily business. Now, though these familiar cases continued, Holmes also received matters shaped by expectations of his method cases chosen because the inquirers believed they required a level of observation they associated with his name. This shift did not alter Holmes's tone. He approached every puzzle with the same measured pace, whether the issue involved a damaged hinge or an inconsistency affecting an entire department. One of the first notable inquiries of this period arrived from a newly established manufacturing firm in Southwark. The firm produced small mechanical instruments intended for export, and inconsistencies had appeared in the calibration of their measuring devices. The director requested Holmes's assistance after reading a published account describing his work on a similar matter. Holmes visited the factory with Watson one early morning, moving through the workrooms as workers prepared their stations. He observed the tools, the arrangement of machinery, and the organization of the materials. Holmes examined several devices showing inconsistencies. He compared them with devices that functioned correctly, studying tiny variations in pressure and alignment. He soon traced the problem to a single step in the finishing process. The workers polishing the instruments used cloths treated with a residue that affected the sensitivity of the calibration springs. The residue came from a well-meaning but unnecessary cleaning solution introduced recently. Holmes demonstrated how even minimal contact altered the tension. The director removed the solution from use, and calibration returned to normal. The factory offered Holmes a demonstration instrument as thanks, which he placed on his desk among other curiosities. Another inquiry came from a schoolmaster in Kensington, who noticed irregularities in student records. Names appeared misaligned on certain pages, creating confusion about attendance. Holmes inspected the registers, measured column spacing, and compared handwriting pressure. He identified that the misalignment occurred only in records written on days when the school's heating system caused expansion in the wooden writing table. The slight change in angle affected the schoolmaster's usual alignment. Adjusting the table's position resolved the problem. The schoolmaster thanked Holmes and sent a set of high-quality pencils, which Holmes tested for graphite consistency before placing them neatly in a drawer. Shortly after, a clerk from the Ministry of Transport arrived at Baker Street, with diagrams showing discrepancies in route calculations. Holmes studied the diagrams, noting that the inconsistencies formed a steady progression rather than random error. He traced the issue to an outdated conversion factor used by a junior assistant. The assistant had relied on a chart from an earlier regulation cycle, unaware that the standard had changed. Holmes pointed out the correction, and the ministry updated its training materials to prevent future confusion. Holmes continued to accept cases from various industries. A confectioner asked him to determine why chocolates cooled unevenly in the shop's display cabinets. Holmes examined the cabinets and found that the glass panes varied in thickness, causing unpredictable temperature distribution. Replacing the uneven pane corrected the problem. The confectioner sent a small box of sweets in appreciation, which Holmes passed to Watson. Another inquiry involved a furniture maker troubled by faint warping in a set of chairs. Holmes inspected the workshop and found that the wood had been stored too close to a stove, causing one side to dry faster than the other. Moving the storage racks away from the heat source resolved the issue. The furniture maker expressed gratitude, offering Holmes a small carved wooden box. Holmes also visited a private library, whose curator worried about mysterious marks appearing on book spines. Holmes examined the shelves and discovered that a newly installed gas lamp produced subtle heat fluctuations along the upper shelf. The leather spines expanded and contracted unevenly, creating the marks. The curator replaced the lamp, preserving the collection. During this time, Holmes's cases grew increasingly technical. A telegraph office sought his help after experiencing delays in message transmission. Holmes examined the wiring diagrams, compared timestamps, and inspected the routing devices. He discovered that the delays occurred at predictable intervals caused by a slightly corroded relay plate. The corrosion created intermittent resistance. Replacing the plate restored efficiency. Holmes and Watson also visited a warehouse where goods had shifted inexplicably during storage. Holmes observed the placement of crates, examined the floor, and identified minutes settling in one corner caused by underground vibration from a nearby factory. The warehouse reinforced the flooring, preventing further movement. A tailor requested Holmes's assistance after several garments displayed identical faint creases along the lower seam. Holmes inspected the workspace and found that a recently installed rod along a wall sagged slightly due to poor installation. Garments hung on this section absorbed the shape of the sag. The tailor corrected the installation, and the problem ceased. Holmes's method often required him to examine processes rather than products. A glassblower from Holborn reported fractures in finished pieces. Holmes visited the workshop, observed the cooling process, and discovered that drafts from an open skylight caused uneven cooling. The solution involved adjusting airflow. The glassblower thanked Holmes with a polished sphere that Holmes placed beside the magnifying tools. As Holmes continued his work, the public showed increasing curiosity about his methods. Some clients sought him not because their cases demanded advanced analysis, but because they wished to see Holmes apply his techniques. Holmes dedicated the same discipline to these as to any other. He did not adjust his tone for audience or expectation. His work remained grounded in the same principles. Observe, compare, and identify the simplest explanation consistent with the evidence. One such case involved a wealthy collector who believed certain artifacts in his possession were shifting slightly on their display shelves. Holmes visited the collector's home, examined the display room, and determined that vibrations from a nearby set of heavy doors caused small movements over time. The collector adjusted the placement of the artifacts, eliminating the issue. Another case involved a mail sorting office troubled by repeated misrouting of envelopes. Holmes studied the sorting racks and watched workers handle mail during peak hours. He identified that one clerk inadvertently placed envelopes at a slight angle on the conveyor system, causing them to slide into incorrect bins. Holmes demonstrated the exact movement, and the office adjusted training procedures. One particularly detailed inquiry came from a company printing official documents. Certain forms displayed faint secondary impressions resembling the beginnings of a duplicate page. Holmes examined the paper under angled light and found that the impression came from a roller in the printing press that had begun collecting residue. Cleaning the roller restored clarity. The company issued a statement thanking Holmes, which newspapers printed briefly. Holmes also received cases involving domestic issues. A homeowner noticed unusual marks on a marble countertop. Holmes examined the marks and identified them as mineral deposits from evaporated water. Adjusting the cleaning method prevented recurrence. Another homeowner reported a persistent tapping sound in the attic. Holmes traced the noise to expanding metal pipes affected by fluctuations in temperature. A simple insulation adjustment resolved it. Holmes continued to refine his scientific studies during this era. He expanded his tobacco ash collection, testing new blends that arrived from various districts. He updated his ash comparisons with new classifications, noting how recent manufacturing changes affected burn patterns. Watson occasionally assisted by labelling tubes or recording notes as Holmes dictated observations. Holmes also deepened his handwriting analysis charts. He created new diagrams demonstrating how ink flow varied under different humidity levels, adding these to his earlier tables. He performed experiments using multiple types of ink, comparing viscosity and pressure. These charts became increasingly valuable as more clients sought his help with document inconsistencies. Holmes began conducting small airflow tests around the sitting room using thread hung from thin rods. He measured how air currents shifted depending on window position. Watson refrained from commenting. Holmes later folded the threads neatly and stored them for future experiments. Holmes's reputation brought him a case from a significant institution, a museum concerned about unexplained specking on several artifacts. Holmes examined the specks and traced them to microscopic fragments from a cleaning brush used on an adjacent exhibit. The brush shed fibres under certain pressures. The museum adjusted its maintenance schedule, and the specking stopped. Another high-profile inquiry involved a railway company concerned about recurring minor delays. Holmes examined telegraph logs, studied train schedules, and observed operations at a key switching station. He identified that an operator's hesitation of mere seconds at regular intervals created cumulative delays. Holmes explained the mechanical effect of repetition on the overall schedule, leading the company to adjust procedures. Throughout these new cases, Holmes did not change his approach. He still preferred early morning walks when the city was quiet. He still conducted experiments with steady pacing. He still approached every inquiry as if it presented the same weight of interest. His equanimity shaped his reputation as much as his skills. Yet Holmes's work did not entirely avoid complexities resembling those of earlier years. On occasion, he encountered matters that bore faint traces of coordinated interference. Nothing as intricate as Moriarty's network, but occasionally a pattern emerged that suggested deliberate manipulation. One such case involved misaligned shipping logs across multiple docks. Holmes recognized familiar pressure patterns on certain entries, though the overall structure lacked Moriarty's mathematical rigor. He traced the matter to a small group attempting to imitate earlier methods. Scotland Yard handled the group without difficulty. Another case involved coded markings found on crates transported through a railway hub. Holmes identified the markings as attempts to replicate older systems, but noted that the coding lacked structural consistency. He documented the deviations and concluded the imitator possessed only shallow understanding of prior methods. Holmes treated these cases with the same calm pace as all others. They did not disrupt his daily work, nor did they require extraordinary procedures. He simply added them to his files and returned to Baker Street to update his diagrams. As these new cases accumulated, Holmes's public recognition grew accordingly. People began referring to him as an expert not only in investigation but in problem diagnosis across fields. His work demonstrated how observation could clarify complexities, whether they involved machinery, documents, or daily routines. Holmes did not seek this recognition. He continued living with the same rhythm: early reading, midday casework, evening experiments. He maintained his violin, producing steady tones that filled the sitting room at night. Watson could often tell when Holmes reached a point of conclusion in his thinking, as the violin would fall silent mid-phrase. Holmes also resumed correspondence with professionals abroad, offering guidance on measurement inconsistencies, document analysis, and environmental effects on materials. He never addressed personal matters in these letters. His focus remained on practical solutions. During this time, a particularly elaborate case arrived from Scotland Yard involving faint imprints on forged documents that circulated within a government office. Holmes studied the imprints, compared them with his handwriting catalogues, and identified the forger's technique as stemming from a former clerk who misunderstood certain alignment methods. Holmes explained the mechanical and procedural causes and allowed the Yard to address the matter. Another inquiry involved a banking institution, troubled by subtle arithmetic adjustments across multiple accounts. Holmes compared ledgers and found the adjustments resulted from misread figures caused by low-quality ink. The institution replaced its supplies and standardized practices. Holmes continued accepting cases from individuals as well. A seamstress requested help identifying the source of recurring thread breakage. Holmes found that the thread had been exposed to fluctuating humidity near a window. A stationer asked about unexpected impressions on envelopes. Holmes traced the impressions to pressure from a storage container. As his caseload expanded, Holmes added new categories to his files. He created a section dedicated to airflow-related cases, another for temperature fluctuations, and another for mechanical misalignments. These categories helped him cross-reference patterns and anticipate solutions. Watson observed that Holmes rarely revisited the subject of Moriarty during this era. Holmes had moved beyond those patterns, focusing on the evolving landscape of London's industries and institutions. Occasionally, a piece of evidence resembled earlier structures, but Holmes treated these as isolated events. Holmes's curiosity also extended into new areas. He began studying the effects of new industrial materials entering the market: rubbers, alloys, and manufactured papers. He tested how these materials reacted to pressure, temperature, and moisture. Watson saw Holmes examining samples with steady attention, noting differences with the same care he once applied to ash or soil. Holmes also updated his environmental charts to include new sources of soot and residue produced by expanding tram lines. He collected fresh samples from various districts and added them to his catalogue. Holmes grew briefly fascinated by the sound of new tram wheels. He recorded their tones at different speeds, comparing them with older wheel types. Watson listened without comment as Holmes catalogued the results. The sequence of new cases continued uninterrupted. A university requested Holmes's evaluation of anomalous results in a scientific experiment. Holmes found that variations in glass thickness caused inconsistent readings. An apothecary sought help with discoloured bottles. Holmes traced the problem to sunlight refracting through a window pane. A shipping office struggled with misplaced parcels. Holmes discovered an angle discrepancy in sorting chutes. Holmes addressed each with the same calm clarity that had marked his entire career. Baker Street settled into a steady rhythm. The sitting room filled again with samples, instruments, diagrams, and the familiar sound of Holmes examining evidence with quiet discipline. Clients arrived at regular intervals. Watson managed correspondence, and London accepted Holmes's presence as part of its daily operations. Holmes continued his work without spectacle, allowing the city's puzzles to guide his days and filling each notebook with precise, measured observation. The final years. Holmes's later years unfolded with the same measured steadiness that had defined the earlier periods of his life, though now shaped by quieter rhythms and a city shifting into new patterns of industry and communication. London continued expanding, tram lines lengthened, factories adopted updated machinery, and new administrative systems emerged across government offices. These developments did not diminish Holmes's work. They simply provided new materials, new conditions, and new puzzles that reflected the city's ongoing transformations. Holmes adapted to these shifts with characteristic calm, incorporating each change into his understanding of how evidence behaved under evolving environments. During these years, the sitting room at Baker Street acquired a subtly different atmosphere. Holmes's collections, which had begun with samples of ash, soil, handwriting, and fibres, expanded to include materials reflecting the city's industrial changes. He gathered samples of newly manufactured paper, tested differences in ink produced by emerging companies, and compared the texture of modern construction materials with those of earlier decades. The shelves grew heavier with labelled jars and boxes. Some contained soil from recently paved streets, others held metal shavings from new railway tracks, and several displayed variations of electrical wire insulation introduced by telegraph companies. Holmes maintained these collections as part of his daily routine. After addressing an inquiry or conducting an experiment, he often returned to the shelves to update labels, rearrange categories, or create new subgroups. His handwriting remained crisp and consistent, though he sometimes paused to study a label before continuing, as though reviewing the memory of its placement. Though Holmes no longer walked the city as extensively as he once did, he still conducted early morning outings to observe environmental changes. He visited newly paved streets to inspect residue left by overnight carriages. He studied the soot produced by updated lamps, adding samples to his charts. He noted how construction in expanding districts altered airflow patterns, sometimes affecting how dust settled along building fronts. Watson accompanied him when possible, though he increasingly encouraged Holmes to accept carriage rides for longer distances. Holmes complied on practical grounds, but continued to walk whenever his routes remained short enough for comfortable travel. Cases continued to arrive throughout this period, though Holmes handled them at a moderated pace. One of the first inquiries he accepted in these later years came from a chemist troubled by irregular crystallization in a compound. Holmes examined the samples under varied lighting, compared their structure with earlier compounds, and identified the irregularity as the result of a new cooling method introduced by the chemist's assistant. Adjusting the cooling time and temperature restored consistency. The chemist thanked Holmes and sent a small bundle of laboratory notes, which Holmes added to his scientific references. Another case came from a railway office concerned about inconsistencies in telegraph receipts. Holmes reviewed the receipts, observed the ink distribution, and traced the problem to a slight misalignment in a newly installed telegraph key. The misalignment produced faint indentations that altered ink flow under certain pressures. Adjusting the mechanism corrected the issue. Holmes filed the case neatly and placed samples of the affected paper into a folder marked Telegraph Later Period. A printer approached Holmes with concerns about faded lettering on recently produced publications. Holmes examined ink samples, noted their viscosity, and discovered that a supplier had introduced a formulation change without notifying the printer. The new ink reacted differently to heat. Holmes recommended adjusting drying times. The printer implemented the suggestion with success. Holmes also assisted a watchmaker who observed that several timepieces displayed identical deviations in movement. Holmes dismantled one of the watches carefully, compared its gears with earlier models, and found that a recently adopted alloy expanded at a rate different from the alloy used in older pieces. Holmes explained the effect, and the watchmaker adjusted his materials accordingly. These cases reflected the changing nature of Holmes's work. The puzzles now often involved updated materials, new industrial methods, or modern machinery developing across London's expanding infrastructure. Holmes adapted without difficulty. His habits evolved, but the core method remained the same. Watson noticed these shifts as well. Though Holmes's pace slowed slightly, his mind remained firm. He retained the steady focus that had always characterized his work. Watson sometimes observed Holmes sitting in the armchair near the window, turning over a fibre sample or comparing ink patterns in old and new documents. Holmes's face reflected quiet concentration, not nostalgia. During these years, Holmes also developed an interest in agricultural matters, an unexpected shift, though entirely practical once explained. London grew increasingly dependent on imported goods, and discrepancies in shipment quality sometimes reached Holmes's attention. He began studying soil sent from agricultural districts, comparing mineral content and moisture levels. He catalogued how these differences affected produce during transport. These observations eventually led to his involvement in a case concerning irregular bruising on apples delivered to a grocer. Holmes traced the bruising to a combination of humidity changes during railway transport and an improperly cushioned crate design. The grocer implemented Holmes's suggested adjustments, improving the condition of future shipments. Holmes's agricultural studies also produced a gentle quirk Watson found both amusing and familiar. Holmes began testing seed germination rates under controlled conditions in the sitting room. Watson returned home one afternoon to find small wooden trays arranged neatly along the windowsill, each labelled with soil type, moisture level, and planting date. Holmes explained the experiment succinctly and resumed recording results. Watson simply nodded and opened the window slightly to allow fresh air into the room, prompting Holmes to adjust his notes accordingly. Holmes continued to assist Scotland Yard intermittently. Though energetic inspectors had taken on much of the routine work, they still sought Holmes's help when a case involved subtle patterns or experimental techniques. Holmes never declined out of disinterest. He simply prioritized cases based on whether the evidence could benefit from his method. One such inquiry involved irregular soot deposits on windowsills outside a warehouse. Holmes examined the deposits and found that new machinery installed within the warehouse produced soot of a specific composition. The deposits matched only areas near vents that had been partially blocked. Adjusting the vents resolved the matter. Another case involved a set of forged signatures that appeared convincing to untrained eyes. Holmes compared the signatures under magnification, identifying minute inconsistencies in downward strokes and ink distribution. He traced the forgeries to a clerk who replicated handwriting without understanding pressure variation. Scotland Yard addressed the situation without further complexity. Throughout these years, Holmes gradually reduced his direct involvement in field investigations. His knees stiffened during long walks, and certain outdoor conditions proved less comfortable than before. Watson suggested that Holmes consider spending more time in rural surroundings, where the air might benefit his health. Holmes resisted initially less out of stubbornness than caution about relocating his collections and tools, but he eventually entertained the idea as his stamina shifted. Around this time, Holmes received a letter from a retired inspector living near Sussex. The inspector mentioned that several beekeepers in the area reported irregularities in hive production, and wondered whether Holmes might offer insight. The letter interested Holmes immediately not because of the mystery itself, but because the subject aligned with his growing interest in environmental effects. Holmes replied requesting details about hive construction, pollen sources, and seasonal variations. The inspector sent samples of honeycomb, pollen dust, and wax. Holmes studied them with increasing curiosity. Watson, noting Holmes's engagement, encouraged him to visit Sussex. Holmes agreed to travel temporarily, intending only to examine the hives firsthand. But upon arriving in the countryside, he found the air clearer, the pace gentler, and the environmental conditions ideal for experimental observation. He spent several days moving between hives, studying pollen distribution, bee behaviour, and hive construction. He recorded these observations with the same precision he applied to ash and soil samples. During this visit, Holmes recognised that the countryside provided conditions suitable for ongoing study without the constant demands of London cases. The open air eased his breathing, and the quiet allowed deeper concentration. Though Holmes did not announce his decision immediately, Watson sensed a shift. Holmes returned to London with extensive notes on bees, pollen variation, and environmental patterns. He organised the observations into new charts and discussed them with Watson over several evenings. Watson listened attentively, recognising the early signs of transition. Not long afterward, Holmes received another inquiry from Sussex. This one involved variations in honey clarity across different locations. Holmes responded with detailed analysis and instructions for gathering more samples. As he worked, He remarked quietly that such investigations could occupy him indefinitely. Watson acknowledged the remark with a quiet nod. Holmes spent the following months completing outstanding London cases and arranging his materials. He refined his catalogues, updated his ash classifications, and distributed certain tools to colleagues who could use them. He also began mapping out a larger study on environmental influences on bees, outlining experiments better conducted in rural surroundings. One afternoon, Holmes placed a small set of keys on the table near Watson. He explained that he intended to relocate to a cottage in Sussex where he could conduct long-term studies. Watson accepted the news without surprise. He expressed support for the move, understanding that Sherlock Holmes had reached a stage of life guided less by urgent cases and more by steady inquiry. Holmes travelled to Sussex quietly. The cottage he selected stood among rolling fields, near enough to villages for supplies but far enough to ensure uninterrupted study. He brought with him only the essential tools, lenses, notebooks, charts, and a modest collection of ash and soil samples. He left the bulk of his London materials in Watson's care, trusting him to preserve the remaining records. Holmes established new routines in Sussex. He rose early to examine hives, observed bees at various stages of activity, and recorded how sunlight angles affected flight patterns. He studied variations in pollen colour and compared honey clarity across seasons. His notebooks filled steadily with new categories and diagrams, each reflecting the same disciplined attention he had applied to London's puzzles. Visitors were rare. Occasionally, a local farmer sought advice on crop patterns or soil conditions. Holmes offered guidance based on observation. Watson visited when he could, bringing medical journals and occasional tidings from Baker Street. Holmes welcomed these visits with calm appreciation, though he remained content in the solitude of his studies. Holmes's later years became a sequence of quiet experiments, calculations, and gentle walks across the fields. The intensity of earlier decades softened into contemplative work sustained by natural rhythms. Holmes did not retire from observation. He simply transferred it to a different environment. He continued writing monographs, including a substantial work on bees that reflected years of study. The monograph combined practical advice, structural analysis, and observations made through countless hours of steady examination. It circulated among beekeepers and agricultural researchers who praised its clarity and precision. Holmes lived his final years in that steady manner, surrounded by bees, sunlight, and the quiet continuation of a mind that had spent a lifetime measuring the world. His legacy remained not in drama, but in clarity, precision, and the steady method he applied to every puzzle, whether found in a London street or a field of clover, cold summer, and the case. Holmes's years in Sussex settled into a pattern of steady investigation, quiet reflection, and the measured routines that suited his later life. The fields around his cottage shifted with the seasons, offering new conditions for study changes in airflow, soil moisture, pollen distribution, and the subtle variations in hive behaviour that could occupy his attention for days at a time. He rose early, sometimes before the sun fully cleared the downs, and walked the perimeter of his property with careful steps, observing how temperature influenced morning movement among the bees. He kept meticulous notes, not out of habit alone, but because the structure of the work satisfied the same intellectual rhythm he maintained throughout his career. Watson visited often during these years. The train ride from London became familiar, and Watson enjoyed the quiet transitions from crowded stations to the open countryside. He always found Holmes either writing, weighing samples, or standing quietly among the hives with the same stillness he once used when examining footprints along foggy city streets. They spoke of present matters, rarely of past cases. Their conversations remained grounded in observation. Holmes discussed hive pattern fluctuations, Watson described medical advances, and both recognized how the world continued adjusting itself without need for recollection. Despite Holmes's retirement from active consulting, certain inquiries still reached him sent by individuals who believed his insight extended naturally into rural life. Holmes accepted only those cases that suited his environment and strength. One such inquiry arrived one afternoon with the simplicity of a routine letter, though it carried elements that drew Holmes's attention immediately. The message came from a small estate some miles south of his cottage. The owner reported repeated disruptions in the estate's cold storage building. Vegetables and fruit stored for the summer season showed unexpected deterioration, and the staff suspected some fault in the structure. The problem persisted despite several attempts at repair, and the owner sought Holmes's advice after hearing of his methodical mind through a local acquaintance. Holmes read the letter twice, placed it neatly on his desk, and began preparing his instruments. He took only a lens, a small notebook, and a few simple measurement tools, nothing more than he required. Watson, who happened to be visiting at the time, observed Holmes's preparations and offered to accompany him. Holmes accepted without hesitation. They walked to the estate the following morning. The path wound through fields, slowly turning from spring softness to early summer dryness. Holmes noted temperature changes along the path, commented on soil composition in passing, and kept a steady pace that suggested both strength and economy of movement. When they arrived, the estate manager greeted them politely and guided them to the cold storage building. The structure was built partially into the ground, with thick stone walls and a wooden door reinforced by iron hardware. Inside, wooden shelves held baskets of produce, potatoes, carrots, apples, and preserved goods. Holmes examined the interior in silence. He moved slowly, touching the stone walls lightly, inspecting the shelves, and studying the wooden beams supporting the ceiling. He then crouched to examine the floor, running his fingers along faint lines of dust. The estate owner explained that deterioration occurred irregularly. Some batches spoiled prematurely, others remained intact. They suspected moisture intrusion or airflow inconsistencies, but found no obvious cause. Holmes listened calmly, then turned his attention to the upper corners of the room. There he found faint discoloration in the stone, barely visible to anyone not searching for it. Holmes traced the discoloration with a careful fingertip and nodded once. He then asked to examine the exterior. Outside, Holmes inspected the stonework along the building's north wall. He pressed gently at the mortar and noticed slight variation in texture. He stepped back several paces, studying how light fell across the surface. After several minutes of observation, he returned inside and examined the baskets of produce again, selecting an apple that showed early signs of spoilage. He studied the pattern of deterioration and compared it with another apple beside it, which remained firm. Holmes returned the apples to their baskets. Then he stepped outside with Watson, stopping near the north wall. He pointed to a narrow section where the mortar line thinned almost imperceptibly. Recent temperature fluctuations, he explained, caused intermittent contraction in the stone. This contraction allowed warm air to seep through in intervals. The cold storage building, though well designed initially, had not been maintained with attention to new seasonal extremes brought on by shifting local climates. As warm air entered through the compromised mortar, microclimates formed inside the building, affecting only produce stored nearest the wall. The estate owner listened quietly and asked whether repairs could be made. Holmes recommended reinforcing the mortar with updated material more suited to recent weather variations. He also suggested rotating storage positions periodically to equalize exposure. The owner thanked him, and Holmes accepted the gratitude with the same quiet nod he had given countless clients in years past. As Holmes and Watson left the estate, Watson remarked not dramatically, simply an observation how Holmes's methods remained unchanged despite age and environment. Holmes replied that evidence retained its consistency across all conditions, whether in a bustling city or a quiet field. Watson smiled at the statement, recognizing its understated humour, a small quirk Holmes introduced without intending to amuse. Over the following weeks, the estate implemented Holmes's recommendations, and the problem ceased. Word of the resolution reached nearby communities, prompting a small wave of inquiries suited to Holmes's rural surroundings. A beekeeper sought help diagnosing inconsistent honey clarity. Holmes traced the issue to bees gathering from a field with newly introduced flower varieties that altered pollen distribution. A miller asked about fluctuations in grain texture. Holmes discovered that moisture from a recently constructed outbuilding drifted toward the millstones during wind shifts. A gardener consulted him about sudden wilting in sheltered beds. Holmes identified soil compaction caused by recent equipment use. These inquiries provided Holmes with steady intellectual engagement, each requiring no more than clear observation and practical interpretation. Holmes embraced the rhythm naturally. He spent mornings at the hives, afternoons analysing samples or visiting nearby properties, and evenings reviewing notes. Watson visited occasionally, joining Holmes for quiet walks while discussing developments in medicine, literature, or scientific journals.